colleagues turn off as ever, or turn to silent their electronic devices. Thank you. Right, item 1, apologies for absence.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Hall, and Assembly Member Prince is substituting for her today.
You're welcome, Keith. Declaration of interest, item 2. As ever, can I ask the committee to note the recommendation set out at item 2, and again, as ever, ask members to declare any other interests and relevant interests that are not already detailed therein. Thank you. Item 3, can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting of the Police and Crime Committee held 24th of May and 6th of June to be signed by me as correct. Item 4, summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings, again as listed in the report. Item 5 is action under delegated authority. Can I ask the committee to note the recent action taken by me under delegated authority to agree a response to the government's domestic abuse bill consultation and to agree the arrangements to our visit to Lambeth Command and Control Centre, which we visited on the 20th of June, which I thought was an excellent visit, and I'm sure members that went got a lot out of that. Hi, Flo. And can I ask Missy to note some of the visit to Lambeth? Item 6, can I ask the committee to note the response from the Mayor to our report respecting others tackling antisocial behaviour in London, which is detailed within the papers. Great, thank you for that. So, moving to the substantive item of business, which is the question and answer session. Again, I welcome our guests this morning. We have some questions for you, and look forward to hearing your responses. Before we start the questioning, I think we've been asked, particularly on behalf of Assembly Member Sean Berry, Commissioner, if you could give us just a brief statement on the status of the Grenfell investigation, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and Chair. Obviously, on the 14th of June, the Met, together with the whole country, paid our respects and remembered all those people who died, and indeed everybody affected by the Grenfell Tower tragedy. We continue to work very closely with the public inquiry in terms of liaison with them, support to the inquiry, and of course monitoring what is appearing in the evidence at the inquiry. So all evidence heard at the public inquiry will be considered part of our ongoing police investigation. The investigation remains very active. We've made significant progress, I would say, over the last year. We still have a considerable number of officers. It obviously fluctuates a little bit, but at the moment it's at least 190 officers and staff working on the investigation, and we are working very closely with the Health and Safety Executive as well as other relevant bodies. Our investigation is focused, as I think you are aware, on 4 themes: construction, refurbishment, management of the tower, and the emergency response on the night. We have completed collectively the forensic examination of the tower as much as we think we need to, and we're now in a phase where we are doing a whole series of very significant off-site tests. I say we, of course this is the buildings experts and a number of other experts together with police officers. A significant test took place recently, as an example, in relation to flat 16, which we believe to be the seat of the fire, and we recreated the flat and its surroundings, and a very significant test took place. We're working very closely with all parties to work out when and indeed to who and how the tower will be returned to responsible bodies, and we anticipate that will be, we certainly hope, in August. We're working very closely with the bereaved families and people in the local community, as you know. And we have also had a significant, I would say, number of associated investigations in relation to frauds. housing and support claims by people who claimed to be victims of the fire when they were not. These range from £25,000 to £100,000 in total value. We've investigated so far 26 of those. 5 people have been convicted, 4 people have been charged, and we have a number of other ongoing investigations.
Thank you very much, Cressida. Do you want anything, just a brief supplementary question at all?
Do you anticipate when you might bring any charges in any of those 4 themes that you outlined?
No, I've got no timescale for that, I'm afraid, Sian. I've always said it will be a long investigation, and it most certainly will. It is complex. It is an enormous amount of material to work through and to consider. We're making good progress. We're moving as fast as we possibly reasonably can. It's obviously not going to be quick, and I don't think anybody thought it would be.
Is it dependent on the public inquiry? Are you waiting for that?
We're not waiting for the public inquiry. The public inquiry is taking place in parallel, and you know, as that goes forward, we take all the material into our investigation. But it would be wrong to say we are waiting.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, moving to the questions. The first one that I'll introduce, it is a year on from your Commissioner for your first appearance in front of the committee. And at that time, you made some ambitious aims and projections of what you wanted to achieve within that year about transformation, improving public confidence and getting the best out of everyone in your service. It's been a difficult year, and we know that. How would you feel progress-wise you've proceeded through that year on those stated aims that you made a year ago?
Thank you, Chair. It's been a fantastic privilege to be the Commissioner for the last year and a bit, and I hope this doesn't sound wrong, but I have loved every moment of it, and I'm very proud to do it. In terms of transformation, I believe we've made some huge steps here. You will have seen some of the things that have been happening during the year in terms of, for example, technology, the rollout of the laptops, the tablets, the body-worn video. But there's so much more to it than that. And what I believe we have done in the last year is really bring together, under the leadership, not least of the Deputy Commissioner, Craig, a fantastic portfolio of change, which is ambitious. It's probably the most far-reaching set of changes the Met has ever gone through, and well supported by MOPAC and the Deputy Mayor indeed. We have made some very large decisions, as you know, about, for example, on the estates front, a huge series of decisions, including the purchase of ESB. On the technology front, we have both rolled out changes and made big investments for the future. And I am really very proud of what the people have done. I think we're in good shape. And it goes alongside a sense that I have that we are becoming ever more financially mature. Not to say that we were immature when I started, but the scale of, I'd appreciate the public might not be that interested in this, but I think the committee are, you know, the scale of the change and the initial, at least, financial uncertainties that we were working with does mean that, you know, my people have to have a very high level of strategic financial ability and to be able to run very tight ship. And what I observe, I won't bore you with the detail, but it is that they are running a very tight ship, and our audits show that, our HMIC reports are improving, all sorts of ways. I would say we can be more assured about how we are managing the money that the public give us for the future. So I'm very content with where we are on transformation. I appreciate some of the changes we've made will probably be asked about later on in the meeting. Secondly, on public confidence, it's been a challenging year, as you know, as you have acknowledged, and we have had some extraordinary major incidents, counter-terrorism, of course, and indeed Grenfell. I think the response and the investigations and the work with the public in relation to those was, despite all the horror and awfulness, first rate. And confidence levels seem to be, by the surveys, holding up. I would say, actually, our reputation is high. When I talk internationally, our reputation is high. I think our reputation is good. I'm not complacent about this with government. It's certainly good with national policing colleagues. And largely, I think, good with our partners in general. But with the public confidence, you know I have a particular interest in the confidence gap. And we may come back to this, where some parts of our communities are not as confident in their police as others. And that's a big focus for me. And we've done all sorts of things during this quite challenging year with violent crime going up and increased, for example, enforcement operations going on, to try to reach out, to engage, to explain, and to help people have more confidence in us. We've had these big operational challenges together with changing demand in a variety of different ways. I think we've responded well. For example, the recruitment programs are going very well in the main. We're now recruiting well into our command and control centre, as you will have seen at Lambeth, which was a huge challenge just 18 months ago. But the changing nature of crime, as we've discussed before, the changing expectations from the public, and increased levels of demands is putting a lot of strain on my people. So my penultimate point is the people. I think they're brilliant. Of course, there's the odd one who does something stupid or something goes wrong, but they're fantastic. I think their ethics are great, their skills are good. We need to help them become even more skilled in the digital age, but they are good people working very hard, sometimes under quite challenging circumstances. And we are putting a lot of effort into their well-being and support to them, and their sense that they are properly led, properly equipped, properly supported. They're in good heart, and they're doing a very good job. And just as an example, I know you know a lot about us, but what other police force in the world or service in the world would be sort of sitting in such a fantastic city? None, of course, but looking at the next 10 days, where, as well as everything else that we're dealing with, violent crime and goodness knows what else, we have Wimbledon, we have Pride, we have the Balkan Summit, which has a huge number of protected principles. We have the RAF 100 celebrations, and we have a foreign dignitary visiting head of state coming at the end of next week, and some fairly considerable protests anticipated throughout that period. There's no other police service in the world that does that, and I'm very proud of them.
Yeah, thank you very much, Commissioner. I mean, your last point is a good point, because the exceptional for London is the norm for London. So those events that you talked about over the summer
It's London.
Is London, and you anticipate, or try to anticipate, although one has been sprung on you, which is another thing altogether. But I think over that year, I think you mentioned about changing and increasing demand, which you couldn't have anticipated potentially a year ago. And I'm thinking particularly around serious violence, moped crime, particularly over that year, has created a huge demand on your officers. And again, I would thank you and commend the Lambeth Centre, the command centre there, the work that they're doing, led by Commander Musker. But the fact of the matter is that you had aspirations, and you haven't really touched upon, we have touched upon the public confidence, which is kind of flatlining around 69, and that was an aspiration a year ago. We're going to have questions later about diversity and inclusion and the borough commands later, but people may wish to come in on that. But really, my comment to you is, the aspirations that you had a year ago, do they still hold?
Absolutely. They were long-term aspirations.
Bearing in mind... bearing in mind the changes and the things that we've seen happening the last year. Do those aspirations still hold?
No, they absolutely do. I mean, I laid out my, what my commissionership was likely to be about on day one, and again when I came to this committee. So operationally, I said violence was too high. I said that a year ago. It had started to shoot up in about 2014, and particularly go up at the back end of 2016 into 17. And I said that the twin things of violence and public confidence, violence broadly, of course, defined to include terrorism, to include domestic violence and sexual violence, that was my priority. It will remain my priority. I doubt whether it will go away during my commissionership. It's what I think concerns Londoners most, and the twin of that, the other side of the coin, is public confidence for me. Absolutely.
A thread that follows through all of this obviously is the financial situation you
Yeah.
find yourself in. When I hear presentations and boroughs from senior leaders of Met, they will position that around their presentation to say, for reasons that finance, we're changing our services, for example, and to improve the services. Again, savings have been made. It's well documented that this committee, and on behalf of this committee, I've written to the Home Office seeking a fair settlement for the Met Police. But do you want to give us your indication and thoughts how that budgetary issue is being addressed for the year going forward? Craig will probably come
So
in on this
as you said, you know, demands and expectations went up and changed a bit during last year. I think the themes are consistent. We made a case to the Home Office and Home Secretary and, of course, to the Mayor about the position we were in. And as you know, as a result of that, we received both counter-terrorist money and non-counter-terrorist money last year, and from the Mayor's auspices, over £110 million. That's very welcome. And we feel that we have a more certainty or more confidence in our financial position for at least out, you know, for the next 2 years. So that is a more comfortable position than we were in. I don't want to make it sound comfortable in terms of fat. It's not. It just allows us to plan better. It allows us to make big strategic decisions much better, and it allows us to focus on violence. However, street violence in particular. However, I imagine we will be coming into a spending round at some point, and I absolutely expect, given the nature of, you know, the increases in online crime, changed capabilities required for the future to keep up with technology, so on and so forth, that we will be saying that we have made huge savings. We feel we are getting more and more efficient. We are very efficient. We will be expecting to put in bids for further monies in the future. Absolutely. The staff are, as you said, the staff are working very hard against some difficult demands.
I'm going to bring Len in a minute. So you're saying that the financial situation over that year has been a challenge because that's permeated many of the decisions you've had to make. But you sense you're in a more confident place than you have been through the work that you've done. But you're getting to a position where that is predicated on a need for more funding to continue to deliver services.
I think that's absolutely where we're likely to be.
Is that a fair reflection, Craig?
Yes, and I think the important point in what Cress said, so members who are on the Budget and Performance Committee will know probably 2 years ago, Budget and Performance Committee, one of the recommendations was give some certainty to policing. So the great advantage that allows you to plan is to say, and the work done both in City Hall here with colleagues in the Home Office, is to try and give us a bit of 2 years certainty, because you can then start to plan out. And as Cress touched on, the work now has to focus strategically. How do we position London and the Met for the CSR that we know will come in terms of it? Because that demand that you've seen it out there, is not going away. And we don't know yet what other partners in the public sector will do as part of their settlements. So you'll have seen when you're at Lambeth, there is very clear evidence now of what I would call demand shunt, where an organisation just says, well, we're not doing that service anymore, and we'll pull out of it, and it ends up either with us or one of the other, some colleagues in the NHS would say they're getting it as well. So I think we need that wider joined-up debate.
Thank you. Len.
Thank you for that, and I think thank you for reminding us. I think that against the difficult and challenging background of the policing environment, there is still a lot for us to be optimistic about as you're coming to terms with the new financial settlements and the settlement for policing on the whole, which isn't going to change, is it? So, you know, in terms of developing new ways of working, I was quite interested to hear, I've got two questions, but I was quite interested to hear, and I completely concur with you, the maturity of the Met facing up to financial responsibilities, understanding gives us that certainty over the coming years to plan. And the cuts that you have made has been considerable for an organisation, and the fact that you're still on your feet, still trying to protect our communities from those who wish to cause it harm is quite amazing, because I don't think other organisations have faced that level of change, considering that you are personnel rich rather than in terms of where that is. So my reckoning, you've done sort of 720 million in recent years. You've got a further 140 million of unidentified savings. Last week, there are a number of people, well, there's a few people in this committee that thinks that you're prevalent with waste. I'm not one of those. I was interested to hear about where you had that independent assessment of people coming in. And do you think, you know, in terms of how would you counter and rebut those who believe that you're still a wasteful organisation in using resources? Like I say, I'm not one of those. I think you've made some great strides around efficiencies and value for money. So can you just tell us a little bit more about that independent valuation that gives you the confidence, that gave the Commissioner the confidence to say what she said, and rebut some of the challenges that I think are wrong in terms of some of the issues that we should be challenging you on. You need to be challenged, but not in the area of waste, I don't think is one.
I think can organisations, so a sort of principal point to start with, can organisations always be more efficient? I happen to believe they can. So we all work for that, and that's what we work for. But I think there are a number of areas I'd look at that. So each year you get something called the value for money profiles that are done by HMIC that cover a whole range of service. They're 40 or 50 pages if you print it off, and you can look at individual service lines, you can look where people are spending more than others, and you can do direct comparators. So you don't, in the nice way, you don't have to take our word for it. You can look at that. That's available on HMI's website to look at. So I think one of the big areas of things, some of the issues we've done around procurement savings. So you look at where we've driven some of the cost out. It is around some of those big contracts to drive how we do things in a more efficient way. I've, like everyone, I've seen some of the stories about you can save 30 quid on a police hat there, here, there and everywhere. Yes, of course you can. But if you look, the Met led the national outsourcing contract for uniform and kit. We led that. Other forces have joined it. Linden McMullen, as our Chief Financial Officer, is doing a lot of the work on that wider procurement piece, where there are real savings, and it's not just us saying it, it's the Home Office talking about the level of savings that are coming out of that procurement piece, often led on the back of national contracts we've negotiated.
Okay, I've got a secondary question which goes to a much more wider one about the future of policing and some of the issues there is and some of the organisational change. I just want you to be very clear that when criticism arises around that organisational change, it's usually around the implementation of it or the engagement with others who we think should be engaged when you're doing some of this change. But realising that what's been forced upon you, there is an understanding of why things need to change. Now, in June, I think, Commissioner, you told the Home Affairs Committee what we see is a huge rise in expectation, and the demand is putting a massive strain on our people. It cannot go on without hard choices. Either, as I say, more money, smaller mission, greater appetite. I think you've said in other forums, and I've continually questioned and said that, because of the resources that we've got available, it seems that you've got to have the resources that, you know, you've got to do the best with the resources you've got. What do you mean by that? When do we think we're going to be seeing some of those hard choices and some of those issues? And me and you have had debates about policing by consent. When is that debate going to be in the open in a much more concrete way that people can get to what the practical choices that we face if we maintain the level of policing that we have here in London or in the rest of the country? Because that goes to the heart of the matter about further reforms and further changes that the police may need to undertake.
Honestly, Len, I'm not trying to be difficult. I wish I could say, you know, well, June 2019, this will happen and we'll have to debate that. But it's not how the world works, I'm afraid. It's really not. Look at last year. You know, events, and secondly, money. A minister acknowledging that in their view, and this is in no way political comment, in their view, the settlement was fair, but things had changed. Therefore, they were going to find a way to give policing more money, which obviously politicians would debate whether that was the right way to do it, but that's the nature of it. Now, we have made a lot of change, which I believe, in the long run, is the best use of public money. But in that, we have taken out a huge amount of money. And some people don't like some of those changes, and some of it will have inevitably, perhaps because of the implementation bumps, caused some reductions in satisfaction, performance, or whatever. That is in the nature of things. But we have started to do changes to our service levels that some people don't like, and we will have to continue to do that in the future, I suspect, because that's what, the mission for the police, as I've said before, if I could put half the Met into dealing with indecent images, probably, and we'd still be quite busy. The mission is enormous, and we're constantly making daily, weekly, fortnightly, and then large strategic decisions about the level to which we do what, and what level of service we provide. And my sense is that what I'm looking for is, if you like, the powers that be, to as much as it's possible, the political consensus, the Home Office, the HMI, the IOPC and others, to come to a kind of general view about what is a reasonable expectation level of service in a variety of different areas as a whole, rather than constantly saying you need to be platinum standard in this little thing, because we can't be platinum standard in all the little things, I'm afraid.
And what would you see as the catalyst for that debate then? So I think we are, in terms of funding, being driven down a certain road. For me, I think it works at two bases. Where's the next way of reforms and way of working beyond what you're doing now and changes to policing practice, really? And what does that mean for the community that we serve? And some of those are choices. Which are you not going to do and which are you going to do? Or are you, in terms of the politicians, I realise that's a political debate and you're trying to engender a political debate. But I just don't see that quite happening. I think we're political cowards. We may cause problems for public services in some of the decisions we take, but we're not prepared to actually start to do some of the difficult issues of answering the questions that you need to go forward on. Therefore, you still need to reform, because the nature of the resources you receive still doesn't allow you to do, albeit we all say, the complete mission. So where do you think it's going to come from, or do you think we're just going to chug along, or have you seen some signs that I haven't seen and you can point me towards and say, actually, there's a debate going on there and you need to join in it, challenge us to join in it?
I think tactically we're doing it all the time. I do think that, and online enabled fraud is an example. There'll be another debate about that, I'm sure, coming up soon. And, we have probably the best invested unit in the country, not, best invested proportionately in the country. The NCA would say that. I'm very pleased with what Falcon do. But Action Fraud meets Falcon, meets, what many people would like. It is not sufficient. And lots of people will say, I'm sure you need to be doing more. And I will probably be resisting that. That is an example. Strategically, you will have seen the Home Affairs Select Committee, a very strong pitch by my colleague Lynn Owens that Sarah and I understand fully and support, which says that the current, long term, probably not for today's, very, very sort of busy political landscape, that long term the structures of policing don't work very well to meet serious and organised crime, for example, and other national and regional threats. That's not a London debate particularly at all. But if we could build capabilities that could really work for that, they probably wouldn't be force by force by force. Everyone could see that. So those are kind of two different extremes, I'm afraid.
Can I just make a comment about some of those questions and some of the issues around budget and value for money, just really briefly, and just in terms of sort of strategic, that your question then about strategically looking at that discussion around resources and service. I think we're having that discussion, and we have made, there's been really significant decisions within the Met and from City Hall that are part of those discussions. Closure of police stations, BCU restructuring, really clearly, yes, about service improvement, but also about saving money and making sure that you're, putting your resources into the front line. So I don't think we've shied away from that. I don't think the Metropolitan Police has shied away from that. There are really difficult decisions to be taken, and some of those tough choices are being taken and have been taken through those discussions, engagements, consultations, and we've been really clear with the public about what's driving it, the two sort of things that are driving it. Just on value for money, I think, Craig talked about HMIC. We have problems with the HMIC calculations of value for money and those accusations of the Met being inefficient compared to other forces, because they're not comparing like with like. London is more expensive, it has capital city responsibilities. So when you get the, London's better resource per head of population thrown at you, it is actually just unfair. And anyway, those figures are coming down from about 4 to 3 officers per head of population. And we have said that to HMIC, and we say that to the Home Office and the Minister of State for Policing all the time. So you've got to be really careful about those value for money calculations, because they are not comparing like for like or really taking into consideration what is happening in London. And just on the budget, I mean, yes, the Home Secretary has a lot of really good warm words, but he has to deliver that. And I'm really concerned he's only talking about a comprehensive spending review, which will land in about 2 years' time, where we know numbers are falling, demand is rising. We need some extra resource to the Metropolitan Police and to all police forces in this year's, in the run-up to the police funding settlement. Otherwise, we've got 2 years of incredible stretch, really difficult decisions, and demand rising, and that's violence and volume crime as well across the country.
Chair, if I may, just pick up, Deputy Mayor made a really important point where actually this committee and the Budget Committee have had influence. So HMIC have moved on this area of area cost adjustment. You'll remember we were often quoted as the Met gets 3 times as much money per. It's actually not the right figure. So HMIC and others have moved on that. And that's as a result of both the Budget Committee here and others saying, look, you're not using the figures in the right way. So we are making progress collectively, and I think that's something to behold.
Thank you. I mean, we do obviously. Oh, you want to come in there, Andrew?
No, just a short question.
Please.
Sophie, your figures of 4 going down to 3 are based on residential population.
Yes.
We've got to bear in mind that upwards of 1 million people commute into London. Who aren't featured in those at all. We don't get many money for them because they'll be paying their taxes in Kent or Hertfordshire or Oxfordshire or Essex or wherever. So we're effectively having to police them for free. Unlike other cities, and places where it's the same area. So, for example, in Hull, it's part of Humberside, so they have people commuting into Hull from all parts of Humberside, but they're still having to pay their taxes towards the police of Humberside.
That's
Yes.
worth stating, but obvious, but also the tourism aspect.
Yeah.
So the numbers coming into London clearly are not like Hull or other towns. But it is right and fair that when a body like the HMIC makes a critique, that we do take heed and take notice and challenge you on it. I think that's fair. And your response is a fair one too. So thank you for that. Right, we move on to the next set of questions, which is around the Met's use of technology, particularly around automatic facial recognition, Sean.
Thank you very much. Yes, so in response to various questions that have been submitted by MPs in Parliament, who are also concerned about automated facial recognition, the government answers a lot of those questions by saying that the deployment is an operational decision for the police, which is a shame because they're asking questions that are factual questions, the kinds we put in as mayoral questions. So we do get answers to those factual questions here, which is good. But I wanted to ask you about the wider issues around it as well. I mean, you've said that the ethical and legal thinking behind facial recognition and other types of technology needs to develop. So are you comfortable continuing to trial facial recognition without the ethical, legal and procedural dimensions being better defined?
Comfortable.
You're very comfortable doing it. Will you be following the recommendations that come out of the Biometrics Commissioner and the London Policing Ethics Panel, who are both looking at this?
Yeah, I mean, we welcome the fact that the Ethics Panel have, which is obviously a joint panel between the Met and Met and the Deputy Mayor, I think, or me and the Deputy Mayor, they work with. We welcome the fact that this is an area that they're looking at, and we anticipate their report will be published shortly, and we've been working alongside them as they've been doing their work, obviously. So as they've been coming up with their thinking, and sometimes us ahead of them or them ahead of us, we've been implementing recommendations as we go. So I'm very comfortable that we will be implementing their recommendations. I'd be very surprised if we were going to fall out about those. And it's a really useful piece of work. I mean, having given you a rather short answer to start with, just to say, I hope the committee would agree. You know, the world is changing very fast. Facial recognition is a fantastic example. I remember being told 12 years ago, facial recognition is just round the corner. It's only a year or 18 months away. It's going to mean you won't be able to use undercover officers, you won't be able to do that, you know, and. Well, here we are, and it is being used in certain circumstances in certain parts of the world in very sort of static ways in sort of 3 or 4 years ago. It's now beginning to move really fast, like all of the rest of technology, and it's getting better and better and better by the minute, and can be potentially combined with other technologies as well. And private sector, good actors, bad actors, and police services will want to use this technology potentially. And my comment at HASC is that a really useful function for the Home Office, for example, is to make sure that the government and are engaging in thorough debates with the public about the balance between privacy and security in the light of changing technologies. And that needs to be done dynamically and quite quickly. But we believe that the public would expect that if there's a technology that we can use lawfully, which we can, this is one, is available, which we are trialling with massive safeguards, which we are, and all sorts of governance and checks, that the notion that that technology might be used in limited circumstances to find, as was recently done in the Stratford trial that you know about, to identify against a small list of wanted offenders for serious violence. I think the public would expect us to be thinking about how we can use that technology, seeing whether it actually is effective and efficient for us. And that's exactly what we are doing.
So, I mean, one thing that isn't moving fast is the legal basis for this. The government's biometric strategy was much delayed and has come out without much forward thinking. The Biometrics Commissioner has said that it doesn't set out a definitive picture of the future landscape and describe this as short-sighted. So the legal basis for it is not particularly clear, but you're clear that you're comfortable deploying it
Absolutely.
on Londoners while that's still in flux.
I'm very comfortable that we're doing the trials. We'll get to the end of the trials, and they are genuinely trials, and we're doing a full evaluation after that with independent people, academics, to see whether how they've worked and whether it's a useful way of doing things, whether it's operationally effective and efficient and. But there is a considerable amount of legislation around its use. A variety of different parts of the law are relevant. I have a commander who authorises every, which isn't necessary, but does, every deployment, and he runs through a set of questions, very like any intrusive activity under the Regulatory Investigation Powers Act. It's very carefully monitored, and the lawyers are, in Met parlance, all over it, and have been from the beginning. So the lawyers are our lawyers, who are very capable, are looking at this all the time, and I'm completely comfortable that the activity we are doing in the trials is lawful and appropriate. I'm delighted that the Home Office have recently announced that they are going to have a sort of advisory and oversight board, because it's not just the Met, it's other police services in the country. And I'm delighted that possibly in the future there will be greater clarity about the roles of the various commissioners, all of whom we have been speaking to, all of whom have an interest in this. And I'm delighted that that people are debating the subject, and it's very important in a liberal democracy that people are debating the subject. I'm completely comfortable with what we're doing, and we're going to carry on with the trials.
Well, that's partly what this committee is for, to debate it.
Yeah.
I've just got a couple of questions, just factual questions about what happened in Stratford. You mentioned that you trialled it last week. I think the date was the 28th of June. I've seen the brief report back from Liberty, who were there observing. They say that no correct identifications were made. They report that one person was misidentified, and despite the police quickly realising he was not the person on the watch list when he produced his ID, he was still subjected to a search. It's unclear from their report whether or not a human checked the image before action was taken against this person. So can you outline the legal basis for doing this to this person? Why was he searched?
No, I can't tell you the exact detail of that. What I can tell you is that the superintendent who has reviewed it was completely comfortable with what went on. In essence, what we do is we have officers who will be monitoring as soon as there's a suggested identification. They may be sort of back behind, or they may be on the scene, if you like. They will then have a quick look at the picture to see whether it looks like it really is, because there's no expectation that this technology will have 100%.
We've been promised by the government as well that will always happen.
Yeah. And they have a quick check and then say whether they're going to whether they think it is appropriate or not to speak to the person. What then follows. It is also perfectly plausible that there's a situation in which somebody will be spoken to for a variety of other circumstances as well during the deployment of this technology. Of course there is. It is very heavily supervised. It is very carefully done. The superintendent who has looked at this completely comfortable with the activity, and I have no reason to doubt what the officers have done at all. I am not expecting, and you shouldn't, I know you don't, Sean, but for the rest of the committee, not expecting this machine to only pick out people who are definitely wanted. That's not how they work. They work to suggest, and then there's a degree of judgment by an officer.
Pick out any people who are wanted.
I believe that in the trials, I would have to double check this, but I believe that in the trials that we have done to date, we have had one person detained as a result of this camera. But to bring some sort of extra realism into it, these are in controlled circumstances with other operations going on around, for example, the knife arches, and you'll be familiar, Sean, with the fact that at Stratford, we did arrest 2 people with very large knives during that operation, not as a result of the technology, but it's one of the tactics and suite of things we were doing. It's a tool. It is a bit like having what we call a super recognizer, an officer who's incredibly good at recognising people. Cressida Dick, Craig, I know he's wanted. I saw him on the briefing list this morning. We have officers who can do that brilliantly well, and others who just don't recognise people. It's a tool, it's a tactic. I'm not expecting it to result in lots of arrests.
So just in terms of the cameras used at Stratford, there was a newspaper video in which some of the officers were interviewed on the scene. That seems to suggest that Transport for London station cameras were being used for this. That's not the case. These were special cameras on a van as usual, or were you using TfL technology?
It may not be questions you're able to answer. You may wish to
Can
write
you come back
to
to us on that?
Back on
Because
that.
that was
Mind. I've got it nearly to hand, but not quite.
They may have made a mistake, but it was certainly concerning to see that. I have one more question about working with other police forces. South Wales Police are also doing trials of automated facial recognition. They did this most recently at an event in Swansea called the Biggest Weekend Fringe. And in their press release, they said they had 3 watch lists, one being intelligence-led around organised crime groups linked to music festivals. So did the Met share any intelligence with the South Wales Police to fulfil that watch list?
You may wish to consider and write to us on that one. It's unlikely your colleagues would know the answer.
That's okay. Can we get the answer to that question in writing, please? And finally, where else are you going to use it? I believe you're going to use it 6 more times this year.
So my note tells me we've got 5 more trials to follow. We are deploying, and another point for the wider committee is we deploy very overtly, so there is a great deal of awareness that we're there with the technology, and we will be doing an overt deployment in Stratford towards the end of this month, which, as you know, has been one of our highest hotspots for violent crime, sadly, both not so much the Westfield side, but the other side of the road in the shopping centre there and immediately around there. But as a transport hub, it's I'm afraid, a real hotspot.
Yeah, we'll continue to scrutinise this.
Thank you for that. It's right that the questions are asked.
Yeah.
Of course, London's public will expect you to properly use any technology that's evolving legally and correctly, and I think that we need to look at that. Right. So next set of questions is around counter-terrorism. The threat remains at severe. Caroline, do you want to lead on?
Yes, thank you very much. As the Chair said, it's severe, it's rating at the moment, and it's likely to continue. I think, Commissioner, you recently said that counter-terrorism is one of the areas of policing that you have most confidence in. So I'm just wondering what you think are the current and future challenges in this particular area.
So I was answering a question about the capabilities of the police in terms of, my confidence in those. And I said it might be counterintuitive given that it's such a dreadful crime and we do face a severe threat. But actually, I do think the capability is in very, very good shape. But you're right to say we're at severe and we anticipate that we will continue to be so. We are as busy as we have been. We have a large amount of threat and risk in London, as you know. And the tempo of our investigations continues to be very high indeed. The last financial year resulted in arrests, I think, of a record level in terms of terrorist arrests, 441, and a large, that's nationally, and a very high proportion of those London ones. You'll have seen some of the trials that have either recently come to a conclusion or indeed currently going on. I won't comment on those. Suffice to say, the ones that are concluded do give you a feel for the very diverse nature of the lethal plots that we have faced and disrupted, together with some of the kind of background issues. In terms of disruptions since the Westminster attack in March last year, overall 13 Islamist-related attacks have been foiled. That's one up from, I think, the last time we put figures out publicly, which is why I mention it. So 13, lethal attacks disrupted, as well as the 5 ghastly attacks we suffered nationally. I think the biggest challenge is to, given that level of activity and demand, and as ever, the terrorist threat continues to morph and change, both in terms of the sort of practical tactics people will use and the way in which they communicate and so forth, is we do recognise that we will need continued sort of sustained investment, and that does need, I think, to be across the system. So people think about the counter-terrorist funding and the counter-terrorist police, but we depend entirely on the wider Met for our counter-terrorist effort. And indeed, we depend very frequently on the efforts of police services around the country who have their own funding challenges. And we're doing that, as we said, against the background of other challenges. In terms of the changing threat, you'll be aware that we are seeing more right-wing inspired extremist, right-wing sort of extremist-inspired plots being disrupted recently, and we've got a number of trials in relation to that. And you'll know that we've had the prescription of initially the group National Action, and then some spin-off groups with different names. We continue to be thinking about overseas, online, and at home. And as ever, Prevent, I think, has, since 2005, I've said it before, been in many respects the most important and in many respects the most difficult of the 4 pillars of the contest strategy. Government have just reissued a revitalised Prevent and indeed whole contest strategy, and we fully support what is in there.
Okay. Do you think that, given the increased threat that you've described and people coming from overseas, and we've seen some of the recent court cases, and the fact the government's put out this revised contest strategy, do you think that's going to put further pressure on your resources, and what conversations are you having with government and also, I guess, security services about how you manage this?
Well, you'll remember that the 3 sort of main areas of focus in the reviews that were done after the attacks last year, assured by David Anderson and came out in his report, were about better use of technology and in particular data and analytics across the system, led, of course, by the agencies in that instance. Secondly, the domestic extremism, extreme right wing, and how we better understood the threat from that. And thirdly, the local work that would be required to improve our understanding of the risk posed by individuals and be able to manage risk posed by individuals in a truly multi-agency way. I think that last which is currently being trialled, does, inevitably require along the way further investment. It's complex, and it's demanding not just on us but on other local bodies potentially, and we're most certainly discussing that with the government. Yeah.
Perhaps, and that includes local authorities and other organisations who have an important role in this field.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. You've said that you'd like to do more work around Prevent. What is it that you'd like the Met to be doing more of, and how easily are you going to be able to deliver that given the resource pressures you've described?
Mm. Well, I think we are, we've been doing this for a long time, and we've got better and better. But nationally, there's still more to do, I think, to make sure that, we've just implemented a new case management system. There's more to do to make sure that we are really tailoring the interventions to the individual, and there's more to do to make sure that the partnerships across Prevent, which obviously involve a variety of bodies, not least the interest that's shown by the mayor and the deputy mayor in this. We need to get really, really joined up even further than we have been in the past. But we're going to in this sort of new way of working, I think we will be dealing probably with more individuals. The greater focus on people who were once of interest to the agencies, but don't appear to be now active. 5-10 years on, they may pop back up, but it may not be appropriate at all for them to be investigated. They just need some support. Likewise, I think we will be identifying more young people potentially, or new people coming into the system, who need a multi-agency effort to try to safeguard and protect them. We're seeing more younger people getting engaged. You've seen some of the trials recently, even involving young women. We're learning as we go. We also learn as much as we can internationally. I've met myself twice recently with chiefs from other countries to talk about, amongst other things, Prevent. I don't think there's a lot that we're not doing that we should be doing that other people are doing. It's a very difficult challenge.
Very much.
Actually, perhaps I could pick up just where you've left off, because what I'm concerned about is the impact of Brexit on our counter-terrorism work. And I think it's about a year ago I asked Craig about this, and I think I may be right with this, I'll have to check, but I think, Craig, you indicated that you were concerned about our ability to access information sharing across the piece, Frontex, Europol and so forth, the impact of perhaps not having a European arrest warrant anymore, which we know is useful after the 21/7 incidents. So I was wondering if there had been any progress in terms of trying to achieve an agreement with our EU partners on policing and security, because obviously from what we can make out from what's in the public domain, there's been very little progress on this.
Andrew, I'm afraid you're not asking the right people. No. We're not involved in the negotiations, and we're obviously not part of the government. What we have done is to lay out what we think is important, what we believe we need, and it's quite hard to plan for all the different scenarios, what might replace in some way, some form, the current measures if they are not available to us after the withdrawal. And we have begun to try to understand more about how those would work and at what cost. But my colleague Richard Martin has been very clear that in terms of crime, we are big users of a lot of the instruments. We are big contributors to Europol. We have, of course, this wonderful diverse population in London, including lots of European citizens from other European countries. And it is likely that if we are unable to access in the same things in the same way as we do now, that it will be, to coin a phrase, clunkier, clumsier, and more expensive, and any replacement system. So it's important for us, we believe, in keeping London safe, to be able to have these accesses. But we fully understand that this has, it appears, become an important part of negotiating between the various parties, which is nothing to do with us.
Well, could I ask, the three things you mentioned, presumably,
Andrew, just
let me finish this first.
Mm-hmm.
Less safe would be another thing from what you've just said as well, should there not be an agreement on these things. And perhaps you could outline you gave a list of some of the things you've put forward to government. Perhaps you could indicate what some of those things are that you think we need.
I think we've covered this before, probably, Chair, but you've mentioned some of them already. So we are very big users of what used to be the joint investigation teams. Yes. We use them more than any other country. And we in London actually have used them hugely. We have enjoyed sitting on the board of Europol and helping to take it forward into the future. And we have 40-something UK subject matter experts at Europol at the moment. We use the arrest warrant. I could give you the figures, but very, very huge amount. And all these things are reciprocal. So we believe that other European countries have very much benefited from our involvement, not least, of course, in terms of countering terrorism. So although the agencies deal in with slightly different legal framework and slightly different ways of working, they do depend on the police often. And I know, I can say, you saw probably what Jeremy from GCHQ said recently, that they obviously have concerns about the future, and they would want us to have, as much as possible, the same sort of accesses as we do now, whatever the frameworks in the future. And we have, I think, been very good and productive and capable users of these instruments. But we will work with whatever we get in the future, of course we will.
So Sophie, you wanted to...
Yeah, the thought of not being able to use the information sharing or being in Europol or the European arrest warrant is incredibly worrying. I mean, the Mayor's, as you know, set out the six red lines around Brexit, around the information sharing, Prüm and, the European arrest warrant. We have been to see David Davis, myself and the Mayor, to lobby him and to really express our concerns around the negotiations, that it does not feel that they are getting very far at the moment, because it seems to be a real issue in terms of Europe, and they are using that. It is incredibly concerning, and when the Commissioner talks about it being a little bit clunkier, what that will mean, at the moment they can, rightly, officers can interrogate databases when they come across individuals. It will mean they have to ring up and get, one by one. That isn't clunkier when you think about the thousands of times it is being used. Security is really at threat around Brexit unless they really get to the point of making a deal and keeping us in all these arrangements.
Okay, thank you. I mean, obviously it's absolutely right that the committee, whatever one's views on Brexit, takes an interest in this and ensure that Londoners are safe, and we'll be watching this as it evolves.
I should probably say, Chair, sorry, I know you want to move on, but meanwhile, we are, still engaged, probably more than ever, in excellent bilateral engagements with all our European colleagues. I myself have met with many recently, and they are in no doubt that whatever the structures afterwards, we of course need legal frameworks. We of course, from our point of view, want as much as possible, and they would as well. But whatever happens, the collaborative co-working between our agencies will continue.
Thank you for that reassurance. Yes. I think that was most helpful. Right, the next set of questions is around basic command units, BOCU mergers, which obviously we've been very exercised about, and we will continue to be so. It talks about the rollout being live by 2019, but those of us that are out on the ground, it feels like a kind of organic rollout already. I think we know that. However, we've got some questions around the latest BOCU rollout. Andrew, I think that's
Thank you, yes. Probably the rollout's going on, and obviously I had one of the Pathfinders in Barnet, in Camden and Islington, and now we've got the Barnet Brent Harrow one coming through as well. One of the things I'm concerned about is the use of response officers to do so-called low-level crime. And the sanction detection rate in the merged boroughs seems to be significantly down compared to the rest of the Met. Is that as a consequence of the response officers being in charge of these investigations?
I don't think you can say as clearly as that in terms of doing it. So the sanction detection rate, if I look at the two boroughs that have just recently gone live, one sanction detection rate has gone slightly up, one's gone slightly down. So there's a couple of bits across sanction detection rates on it, but it has had a change going to my investigation. But it's worth remembering why we did my investigation. So it was absolutely clear it is a long-term thing about skilling up the frontline workforce to carry out investigations, and also particularly from the public's point of view, reducing handovers. So you remember one of the issues when we looked at this was quite strong feedback, also internally in the organisation, but particularly from the public, around an officer comes, then someone else does the next stage, someone else does the next stage. So this keeps ownership where it sits in terms of the front line. So no, I mean, we've spoken before here about sanction detections. There's a whole range of work around lifting detections and sanction detection rates across the piece. So we're absolutely alive to that. It's part of the dashboard as we go live that we monitor. So in the first two the second tranche of boroughs that have gone out, that's absolutely one of the points we're looking at.
Well, you mentioned the fact of the need to train up the response officers to do this work.
Yeah.
Isn't it a bit cart before the horse in putting the mergers in place before the officers have been trained up?
No, so the training has been rolled out in a number of boroughs, and a number have gone live before they go to the new BCUs. So if you look at a number of the boroughs, the My Investigation piece has been coming for about the last 2 years, and a number of the boroughs have already done this before they go to the new BCU models.
Public confidence rates in the merged boroughs seem to be dropping below what they were before. How do you explain that?
Well, I think so some of it, and the interesting one we've looked at, because you'll remember from the first wave of boroughs, one of the issues we looked at was response times in terms of doing it, and particularly in the east area. You remember early on we had some challenges around response times. So we've kept a very close eye on what's happening with response times. I think it's, to some extent, the confidence rates are also a factor of these culmination of changes that are taking place at one time. So we're very alive to it. We're doing quite a bit of work around this at the moment, and it's not uniform across the BCUs as they go live.
Well, the victim satisfaction rate, the Pathfinders dropped 12%. Compared to 6% across the Met as a whole.
Sorry, I thought you were asking me about confidence rates.
I was, now moving on to this.
Oh, right, so you're going to victim satisfaction. Because the victim satisfaction, so you've got to be really clear, satisfaction and confidence are two very, very different things, and they'll be driven in quite different ways.
Well,
so there's a whole lot, so there's a whole...
to victim confidence.
Yeah, but there's a completely different range of work going on around victim confidence, with some of the work going on with the Victims Commissioner and elsewhere in terms of the work we do around victim confidence. And some of that will be around things like detections and outcomes at court, but it will also be wider things like follow-up, clarity of messages and information, and clarity around outcomes. So I'm just being quite pedantic, but they are two very, very different things being driven by quite different activities.
Well, two different questions. Yeah. I'm sorry if it didn't make clear I was asking a separate question. But when do you think public satisfaction on the one hand and victim satisfaction on the other will improve?
So I think public satisfaction will start to move back to the norm, and you are starting to see that in some of the boroughs. But I think you've also got to be, and it feeds into some of the earlier questions that you asked around this wider stretch on policing. So if the constant debate around policing is under stretch and it's under pressure, and the expectation of other partners who sort of step off the field, then you could see further impact on satisfaction around policing as people's expectation of services rise and our ability to deliver them becomes limited. So I think the stuff around confidence, you will so victim confidence, you will start to see some of that move as both the My Investigation beds in and these changes bed in.
And as part of this, the availability of the senior officers to the public as well. And I can contrast that with what's going on in Barnet, Brent Harrow, in that the new borough commander, who's from Barnet, is actually being very good about communicating all the change all the time with the numbers and everything. And I think that helps. With a very wide circulation, I think that helps compared to Camden and Islington, where that isn't happening. In fact, I've still not met the new borough BCU commander in Camden and Islington, months and months on. I think we've finally got a meeting organised for later this month, and we don't seem to get much contact.
It's interesting. I spend most weekends with someone telling me they don't get contact with the borough commander, and usually when I look back at the list, very many people from local partners, local MPs have had some contact. They might miss people, they might not catch everyone, but you look in terms of the rollout, so let's take the southwest, somewhere like that in terms of doing it. The relative noise we saw internally and externally with the rollout of this second wave has been far less than we had with the first ones. So the lessons learned, we were really clear, and we've said a number of times here, we'll take the lessons from Camden and Islington, the lessons from East Area, and we'll transfer them into these. So the noise in sessions internally on our is much, much different in terms of people understanding. Aside from one or two technical glitches, some people said, internally, so what's changed? It was that smooth in terms of some of the things that's done. That's the lessons learned in terms of doing it. And there's a real message around how people manage stakeholders and how people do things. When critical incidents happen and when difficult incidents happen, I absolutely get the clamour for everybody to want information, from government ministers all the way down to the person on the street corner, and we don't always get that right.
It's not necessarily critical incidents, it's just generally knowing what's going on in terms of the change programme. Could I also ask about abstractions?
Yes.
In Camden, there was, I think this may have stopped now, there was a move to abstract from the DWOs for the knife crime strategy, and they were taken off the wards to join in that effort. Now, obviously we've got to do the knife crime strategy, but my understanding was that the DWOs would only be abstracted for very specific purposes.
So I can give you, Camden's CN abstraction rate for May was 7.6%. All the abstraction rates across the DWOs are coming down, and I think it's 16th or 18th of July, you've got a session with Mark Simmons looking in detail at some of this. So the expectations have been quite clear. So some of the big events that the Commissioner covered at the start for the next week coming up, DWOs will be abstracted to support some of those.
Well, that's what I was going to come on to next, which is the important overseas politician, I think it was the Commissioner described it, President Trump. And I'm just going to ask a little bit about that, not so much what you're going to do about it, but my understanding is, as you say, DWOs are going to be abstracted for that. Mm-hmm. The rest of the Met's going on 12-hour shifts. Is that right?
Yeah.
And for how long will that continue, the 12-hour shifts?
As long as we need that level of resilience, depending on the final plans of the operation. Those things will always be fluid right up to it. And quite frankly, I'd expect DWOs. We were always very clear around it. There will always be exceptions. If a visit of a visiting head of state is not one of those exceptions, I generally don't.
I think I can see that in relation to President Trump. Following on from that, what mutual aid are we getting from other forces towards the Trump visit?
I'm not. Go on.
We are not asking for anything at the moment. We're working very closely with other forces. The plans remain extremely fluid, and we're working closely with Sarah Thornton, the National Police Chiefs Council lead, and her team, because if Mr. Trump goes outside London, you'll be aware that Metropolitan Police have responsibility for protection of such a visiting dignitary, but local forces will be dealing with, other matters, including wider security and potentially, who knows, protests. So we're working really closely with others. But to answer your question, at the moment we are not asking for any assistance.
Okay. So as we're responsible for President Trump wherever he happens to go, are we going to get any more funding in the National and International Capital Cities grant towards the cost of this operation? I understand from news reports that Scotland are going to be paid for by the government insofar as policing the Trump visit should he end up in Scotland are concerned. Are we going to get the same?
So I don't think we should comment on Scotland. I don't know what's happening with Scotland, and I wouldn't. But what I can say is we're in very cooperative conversations with the Home Office about the requirements, so they understand why we're doing what we're doing, what we think we may have to do, and indeed what that will cost. And I anticipate that we will be able to put in a very sensible bid, and I look forward to the result.
What do you estimate the cost of it's going to be?
Do you know what? I actually am not going to say off the top of my head today. It is, and this is not unique to this president. You may remember that when Mr. Obama came once, he arrived 14 hours early because of the cloud over Iceland. It is a very dynamic operation. It always is. And we do our best to plan well ahead, to have all the contingencies, but it can be a great deal more or usually a great deal less than our original estimates. So I'm not going to give you...
I don't recall many protests about President Obama coming.
It's a different set of challenges, yeah. Each person brings different challenges. Mr. Modi, Mr. Erdogan, all sorts of people bring different challenges.
Sophie, I don't know if can you add to anything about what's going on in relation to the financing of this?
Well, we'll be putting, the process is that we'd put in a request for a special grant, and we'd expect that to be honoured by the Home Office. So that's in cooperation with the Metropolitan Police, which is how much they actually spend after the event. But those discussions are ongoing. We're having discussions with the Home Office as well about it. But we expect to have a special grant application, and we would want that to be honoured.
We have a very good working relationship with the Home Office on these sorts of things. You will have seen the way that the Chogham thing was dealt with. Our finance people and MOPAC and the Home Office have a very, very, very cooperative understanding about how we cost what. I don't expect this to be a difficult process.
I'm going to bring in a couple of people just now the Trumpian Pandora's box has been opened by Andrew. There's a couple of people want to ask questions around that. My contribution will be, I think you'd be absolutely right for government to support the Met in policing any such event, and if needs be, I would be minded to write to government along those lines. It is different from Obama because no doubt many thousands of enlightened people will be going out on the streets on that day, but I don't include myself in that description. Anyway,
I include myself though.
Of course. I saw Tony first.
When we've had previous visits from American presidents, there's been lots of controversy about the armed entourage which the American president brings with him and the demands that they make over the measures that they take for protecting their own head of state. Can I ask what discussions have taken place in relation to this? In other words, for example, is President Trump expected to bring, I nearly said, a small army with him? Is he expected to bring very many more people in relation to what is said to be an increased security or an increased risk to the president here than with previous presidents? Have we any idea of the quantum of American security armed people who presumably will have some powers who are going to accompany the president?
So you're right, Tony, to say there's always controversy. Frankly, all the controversy, in my view, historically, has been by commentators having arguments who don't know what they're talking about, because we don't comment on the details, and nor will we. We will never comment on the details of how any visiting head of state is protected, but how many people they bring, how many people we bring, what the tactics are, for the most obvious of reasons. But obviously you will also be aware that when an American president comes, it's always a large entourage of various different sorts and a large security operation, and that's of course the way of it this time as well. And we have an excellent working relationship with our American colleagues in the various agencies, not least the Secret Service, who we've been talking to for a long time, and of course everybody from the embassy.
As I recall, the principal controversy the last time was who was it who actually had the last word? Was it you, i.e. the Metropolitan Police, or was it the security detail who brought the president, who were accompanying the president, who would actually decide what would happen?
Gosh.
Who's in charge? in
I'm
other
baffled by
words?
this. We have protected so many heads of state in my time, I cannot tell you. We have excellent working relationships. We work our way through different approaches, different ideas, different tactics, different scenarios. We're very open with our colleagues, wherever they may come from, and always are. We work closely with the Foreign Office and the Home Office on this because there are certain rules about people's entitlements. For example, a visiting head of state, of course, we have a duty under the Vienna Convention, and other people we don't in the same way. So it's a perfectly good working relationship. At the end of the day, the President is here and we are protecting him.
All right. Thank you, Chairman.
And I'm very comfortable that my people are in charge of what we need to be in charge of.
What we want, I think that's what we wanted. I'll get us back to the subject in hand, which is if I'm with some difficulty, Boku's, and I think, sorry, Len and then Caroline.
In terms of lessons learned, in terms of the rollout of this programme, do you think we've sufficiently got, in terms of inside the Met, an understanding that it's not bolt-on, but new ways of working within the resources you've got?
Can you just stick to...
Well, is it bolt-on or is it new ways of working? Do you know what I mean? That we're trying to develop in terms of the overall reform of a basic command unit.
It is a complete new way of working.
Do people understand that inside the Met, do you think, at every level?
Oh gosh, I couldn't give you a 100% every. Absolute. So is one of the challenges, and you and I have spoken about this a number of times. Actually, people look at these things sometimes as structural, and the real challenge is actually business change, for want of a better word. You're right. So I think we're getting better at that, and I think you see that with these two that went live in the last 4 or 5 weeks. I think people are getting that this is quite a different way of working, and you're starting to see that. And you're also starting to see some excitement when people realise, actually, I can do this a bit differently. Particularly in some of the areas around the protection world, and by that I mean sort of child protection. Those people do see that as quite an exciting way of doing it. Does everybody get that yet? No, of course they don't. But there are different stages in the rollout and the pilot. There's a lot of talk, a lot of conversation in the organisation. A lot of those meetings with senior leaders are all about this is a completely different way of working. What's helped with it are some of the technology changes that come with it, because they make it clear that this is not just a business as usual and we're just redrawing the lines on the maps. And that will become even more apparent when later on, sort of tail end of this year, beginning of next year, we start to roll out the replacements of the core business systems. So intelligence, custody, crime reporting, they will all change over the next 12 to 18 months.
So custody will revert back to basic command units?
No, custody as in the basic the system they book you in. That's a very old system. Yeah.
Okay. Look, my colleague's going to talk about safeguarding, so I don't want to take any thunder away from her when she raises that. But I think you raised a very important issue. One of the potential benefits that could be realised in terms of this new way of working is about some of those crimes that are investigated by the various units that we've got. Yeah. So, on domestic violence, can you give us some examples of how this is working? Domestic violence, say, robberies that are not with the independent response officer, presumably if they're cluster robberies, I presume they get pushed up if more than one police officer is dealing with it. Yeah. I presume that. So give us, how does that work? Is that working across the basic command unit, or is that working on a area? I won't refer to boroughs, I don't want to go back there because the terminology about that. So how is that particular aspect shaping up?
So what's happening with and robberies are a really good example. Some quite straightforward robberies could stay as a my investigation by an individual officer. But you remember one of the things, and we've spoken about a lot, the pressure that we're on what we used to call borough CID, so general CID office departments. We spoke about in the previous world, they were swamped, you couldn't get people to go in there, workloads were very high in terms of that. One of the things that the work around my investigation and the sort of redesigning of that whole process has done is to try and create some headroom and space to allow the CID, the investigative strand of the new model, to actually have the time and space to do those investigations. So those more complex ones, those ones where there's a series, those would go into a CID. Now, it may be the CID is actually in your same building that you used to call a borough. It may not be, depending on the geography and layout, but that's why we put the strands in that way.
Okay, and who's holding the ring then? So if I'm a police officer dealing with a robbery, I might not see the wider picture of a number of robberies going on. We haven't got any crime analysts, well, you're going to tell me we have now.
Well,
who's going to pick up that?
Yeah.
And where is that picked up, and how quickly is that picked up for the CID capacity to say, actually, there's something wider here going on. This is not just for the response to deal with, I need a different strategy or tactic. So who's holding that ring?
So there's a daily rhythm as to how the BCU runs, where there's a meeting that often when we're out in the BCU we'll go to and look at, that looks at all the crimes reported that day, what the intelligence is, how they make, and that's how those links are made through that process in terms of, so there's a whole range of other processes with an intelligence function, and we can talk a little bit if you want to about some of the investment that's going into looking at what we need for analysts there, and there's a meeting next Tuesday in relation to that, to look at that. But that daily function looks at, and it meets a number of times a day, looks at what's going on, is it linked up, and it's got all the assets in the room. So the DI from CID is there, the person leading on missing people's there, the person who's dealing with a public order or a violent crime tasking, and that's where that very live focus takes place at a BCU level. That is then replicated, and you'd have seen some of it at Lambeth if you were there at the time, through calls that take place across the Met to ensure that that's replicated across the system and we know what the load is on the system.
Finally, then bring this back to probably new technology, predictive pilots, policing. Yeah. You had a number of pilots that are thinking about different schemes. Have we come down on one particular scheme now? Is that tool now available for these new command units? Are they using it? Is it delivering results, or is it too early on that? Or where's it got to? So
we've not bought a particular predictive product at the moment. We do have all the predictive mapping from the work we've done on that. So if you go on to an intranet page, a briefing page for, let's take a BCU at random, look at it, and you can work out the predictive policing area. So all the mappings there for a very small area of the geography that will work around burglary, robbery, etc. You'll remember some of the work we did with the predictive policing pilots. They're better with property crime, and there's a much stronger correlation between patrolling particular areas with property crime than they were per se with violent crime. One of the debates we're having is, do we look future at one of those products? One of the spin-offs, so to continue on the technology theme, we've spoken a lot around these new joint system, we call it MIPS, that's coming. That has a lot of predictive technology and the ability to do self-analysis as part of the package.
And just to be clear, in terms of the focus on the CID capacity, and we know the problems around, we're trying to deal with the issues of shortages and where it is and using those, how do we guard against the drivers of crime without taking the ball of others? So if I have an old spate of robberies, do I bung the entire CID capacity to deal with that, including taking people off issues dealing with domestic violence or hate crimes, because I need to focus on that because you guys at the centre are telling them to focus on that, or what? So what do we get? So common sense policing around priorities and issues. One of the things that you could have said about the Met is it's great, but when we get focusing on one issue, we chuck everything at that issue at the expense of other issues. How do you manage that? What assurances can we give to our leaders at local level that they're doing it and managing across the piece that they have to do?
That's a fair observation. I would have said in the past there have been challenges with that, we would call it running to one side of the ship than the other, and that's actually quite an easy way for an organisation to solve problems. It's not a very long-term way of doing it. So part of this is, and you and I have spoken about this a number of times, is how your performance management process works right across the organisation. And we're very, very clear in the analysis that we talk to about BCUs, we don't ever talk about just one thing. There might be a focus for that meeting that day in terms of doing it. And of course, and what it does, so your performance management focus meets with that, what I call the daily rhythm of how the organisation runs. There might be a day where it's entirely appropriate. You know, you've got a BCU that's gone way out of kilter on a series of robberies overnight, then of course that will affect the tasking that day. But over the week, over the month, over the longer term, they're going to be asked about a whole range of things that sit in their priorities, that are both local priorities for them, but also are the force-wide ones around violence.
Hold on.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up the sort of Redbridge area pilot on borough mergers had some concerns raised about safeguarding and people slipping through the gaps between the new structures. So really I wanted to get an update from that Pathfinder as to how safeguarding is performing in that particular borough merger, and also what assessment you've made of the west and southwest borough mergers in terms of the area of safeguarding.
I think that is old information. You were right, that was a challenge. I can't give you sort of facts and figures. My understanding is that things have moved on a long way there, and that partners are very comfortable, and the BCU as well are very comfortable with the way the safeguarding is going on both the original Pathfinders. I think it's very early days for the South West to sort of be looking at any kind of results. But, you know, Craig was answering questions earlier on. I have to say I'm absolutely delighted with the way the next tranche have landed, if you like, in every aspect. Yes, there are things we've had to tighten up. Yes, there are things we've had to change slightly. But overall, the effort, the learning from the other Pathfinders, the effort in the planning before the delivery and then going live has gone really well, and great leadership from the two BCU commanders. So I'm expecting safeguarding on the Southwest to be in the same basket, but I will come back to you, Caroline.
It'd be helpful if we could just get something in further correspondence on that. But could I just ask the Deputy Mayor, you know, the Mayor has said he remains concerned about the pace of progress in improving child protection investigation cases. Obviously the borough mergers is a big change in this process. What assessment are you making, whether it's through your London Child Protection Oversight Group, on the rate of progress with this impact of borough mergers?
I mean, I chair the 6 monthly oversight group for child protection, and one of the things I've asked to come back to the next meeting is to look at, we have the overall rates and the overall figures, but to look at what, for example, the case reviews, what they are showing. But at the last meeting I asked for that to be analysed further, to look at what that shows for the Pathfinder areas and whether you can see impact because of the changes in safeguarding in the Pathfinder areas, and you can see that improvement. So I think the next meeting I've got is probably next week, so I'm expecting that to come back, because it's definitely something that, you're right, safeguarding is one of the things, the changes to the structures around the BCU is one of the things that should be making an improvement in the delivery of the improvements in need for HMIC report. Just on the East Pathfinder, I mean, I spoke to the chair of safeguarding in Redbridge at the time, and it must have been over a year ago now that those real genuine concerns, and rightly they were concerned, because Redbridge was at that time had an extremely good Ofsted report, and they were concerned. And actually some of the learnings that came out of the evaluation was about making sure that you included the safeguarding boards, you have that preparation, and that's why I think the changes for South West and West have been a lot smoother, but it's something that we're continually monitoring as well.
But it was still coming up earlier this year from councillors in the borough, so it's not just, there was a feeling that was one of the weaknesses.
I think hopefully you'll be able to take some external comfort. HMIC will publish soon the crime data integrity inspection, and the Met's done well. The Met's got a good, which is extraordinary for an organisation of our size. And given the complexity. But one of the comments in there that the inspectors picked up is officers are spotting the safeguarding issues and they're identifying and flagging them. So it's, in the nicest way, that's not us saying it, that's someone else saying it. So I think there's been some real progress in that space.
obviously we'll get a further HMI report on child protection
Per
later
se,
this
yes,
year.
yeah.
So for the information you talked about, would you be able to share that with the committee? Because I think that would be very interesting if you've got an analysis there of the impact of borough mergers.
And obviously it's also one of the areas that I look at in terms of regular, as was discussed when we met with DAC Mark Simmons, that regular monthly meeting that I have with Martin Hewitt and Mark Simmons, who are in charge of the, operationally much more closer to the detail. Safeguarding is one of the areas that I look at in relation to, are they attending the meetings within 24 hours, which was one of the concerns and the criticisms in the HMIC report. So it's certainly something, not just for the Pathfinders, but across, that we are looking at.
Good, thank you.
We'll add that to the exchange of correspondence after that. Obviously, the committee will continue to return to it. The only point I'll make really is about, Craig, is about the visibility of senior leaders. It was touched upon earlier with the reduction of, obviously, chief superintendents across the boroughs. At this time of reassurance, it's important that the communities and partners are seeing those senior leaders that remain, shall we say, on their patch. Right, the next item is tackling violent crime, which is the subject of the report that the committee is formulating at the moment, and this is partly to reflect on the Commissioner's comments about seeing some stabilisation. Tony, you're leading on this.
But it's precisely that, Commissioner. Is there indeed some stabilisation, and does stabilisation actually mean reduction?
Stabilisation is still the right word. If you go back to 2012, you'll see this sort of U curve came down, and then in 2014 started to come up in many categories of violent crime. You'll remember also, of course, that the increases in the Met are less than countrywide in the main. But recently, if you saw that U chart, you would see it beginning to just plateau over the last few months. And I'll run through a couple of categories to say what has happened most recently. So, for example, knife injury victims under 25, which is something that we track very carefully, has had a reduction. June is 22% less than May. Of course, they do float about quite a bit, but it's a 27% reduction on June 2017. So that is a reduction, but I frankly, when I see that in the context of everything else, and of course the real concern, I wouldn't want to say, so that's the way it's now going. I think we are seeing a stabilisation. Over the last 12 months as a whole, in that category, we've seen a tiny increase overall, year on year, of 1%. Knife crime overall is also stable, is the best way to describe it. There's a tiny reduction between May and June, and again less than June last year. And you will be aware of probably the homicide figures, broadly speaking, where we had considerable concern, of course, earlier in the year about the numbers in particular February and March. These are always small numbers, relatively speaking, so they can fluctuate for all sorts of reasons, but January we had 10, including some ghastly high-profile young people killed, 18 in February, 16 in March, 14 in April, 13 in May, and 8 in June. So I hope that figure is continuing to come down, but of course it's small numbers, and I can't say that we are doing more than stabilising. I did lay out, as I said, that this was a very high priority, all of violent crime, when I arrived. I highlighted street crime, knife crime, gun crime within that. It remains so. We've had a very challenging year, as you know. What is very encouraging to me is the fact that now this is something that, we've shown, for example, in moped crime, how we can really, as of July last year, make significant reductions in the volume. And secondly, the fact, more important strategically, that so many people are now prioritising this as an issue. It's obviously very high up the new Home Secretary's agenda, as it was the Mayor, local authority chiefs, executives and leaders. I could go on. Sophie can say more about this, but this is very important because we, the police alone, cannot solve this problem. Thank you for coming to see, seen some of the great work that's going on and the fantastic focus and effort and innovation of the officers engaged who are terribly, tremendously concerned to stop young people being stabbed and shot in particular. But we can't do this by ourselves, so it's great that other people are coming behind and talking about the longer term measures and what they can do to assist.
You talked about not being able to do it on your own, but on the assumption that it is stabilising, to what do you attribute that?
I think it's always hard to be definitive, of course, but we have since throughout last year we were upping the amount of both uniform, overt and covert effort against this challenge, and we upped that again very considerably in sort of February, March last year, and of course we now have the extra funding from the Mayor to allow us to invest further in that. And the Violent Crime Task Force themselves have been extraordinarily active. You've seen some of this, but in April to June alone, over 7,000 weapon sweeps, over 6,000 stop and searches, hundreds of firearms, over 100 firearms recovered, many hundreds of knives recovered. I could go on. The presence, the activity, the focusing on the most dangerous, and I think more and more help from the public has contributed to this.
In effect, you're saying that because you have put in more effort and more resources at stabilising the problem, are you therefore saying to extend the proposition that you're making that if you put even more police personnel into dealing with violent crime, that would reduce the amount of violent crime?
Again, I can't be definitive, Tony, because the causes are many and varied and complex, and there's all sorts of social trends going on here which are not within the purview even, let alone the control of the police.
Well, I asked this particularly. I don't know if you read the minutes of the last meeting, but I had a small spat with the Deputy Mayor over this.
I'm afraid I missed that.
When she quoted you as saying that there was, and I think for the first time it had ever been said, that there was a link between cutting the expenditure and the increase in violent crime. And yes, I'm saying the Deputy Mayor quoted you as saying that, but I did note that in your response when I asked you to what you attributed this, you did not say it's because more money is being spent on tackling the matter.
I think I said we have put more resources in, absolutely, and more focus. So individuals who were recently, only working an 8-hour day are now working a 12-hour day, or individuals who were working on one thing are now totally focused or even more focused on violent crime. So absolutely there is a resource change, and we have had to rob Peter to pay Paul to put people into the Violent Crime Task Force. So my comment in the past was, one would be naive looking across the country to say that funding across across all our systems, including policing, hasn't had an impact. It's just very complex, of course.
Of course, it's very complex. I was at the meeting, as was the Deputy Mayor last week, in the Friends meeting house in Euston, where Assistant Commissioner Hewitt talked about violent crime becoming feral. I was pleased to hear him say that, because a lot of people believe that to be so. Well, firstly, do you agree with him?
It's a very strong word.
That's why I repeat it.
Some of the behaviours that we see on occasion by young people who appear to be, if you like, in the moment, completely out of control and enjoying, it appears, extraordinary levels of violence and taking excitement and joy out of that. I think many people would describe that as feral. I don't want, however, to suggest that there are, hundreds and hundreds of wild gangs of young children running around London, like some ghastly science fiction film. It's not like that, but the behaviours in the moment are wild. And I think that is what feral means.
Can that possibly be affected by the amount of resources which the police receive? This growth in feral crime?
Yes, it could.
Really? Would you explain why? The example which Mr. Hewitt gave was, for example, with stabbings, and I think the way you put it, the action of the moment, people being stabbed a dozen times and they might have been stabbed only once before, or something like that. They're getting pleasure out of that. How can that possibly be linked with public expenditure?
So that isn't exactly the question you just asked me, but and we may agree violently here. But in essence, we are seeing different behaviours from some young people in certain circumstances. We absolutely are. And it is very worrying because we're seeing more extreme violence when in other other times, other days, other people, it would have appear more likely to just be a quick slash. It's now lots and lots of ghastly stabbing actions which are incredibly dangerous and result in horrendous injuries frequently. That's what we're seeing. Now that of itself as a phenomenon is not encouraged, of course, by policing in any way or by affected directly by funding, but policing, intervening with young people, arresting young people, getting them into other agencies, is an important part of deterrence, potentially education, all sorts of other things in terms of young people. So we have a part to play in stopping young people becoming like that, in getting people into safeguarding. So there's an indirect link, but I'm obviously not suggesting that the reason somebody takes it into their head that that's a good idea is because there's not a police officer around or there's not money to have a police officer around. No. Effective policing can affect the behaviours, of course it can.
I think we've pursued that debate as far as it will probably take us at the moment.
Okay.
Well done. Peter.
Thank you very much. Hello, Commissioner.
No.
Carrying on on the subject of violent crime, it's extremely alarming that there's been something like a 20% rise in rape in London. This was something we discussed as far back, I think, as February when your colleagues were here. 20% rise, that means basically up from 6,392 to about 7,600 odd. Now, I think in any other circumstances, if we didn't have, for example, the knife crime thing we have at the moment, this would be and should be a phenomenal sort of statistic, I think, 20%. When we discussed it in February, your colleagues seemed to say that they said they were unsure, they didn't know what was happening, why. I think the quote that I have here is that there's something going on with sexual offending, but no, we don't really have any idea as to why. We don't understand it. What do you think's behind it, Commissioner?
So firstly, I don't think it's a 20% rise in the last year, whereas the other...
This is from 20%. We were meeting in February, so it was 20% from 12 months to the end of January this year.
Right.
I mean, this sort of rather slipped under the net, actually, or rather, it wasn't really taken up. To me, it's horrifying.
Can I just, sorry, Deputy Mayor, can I just be helpful? The latest figures
we'll get the latest
on the report, actually, which is to May, year on year, is actually 19%.
Okay.
So it's close to what you were saying in the previous minute.
Thank you.
And just
I think it was Craig who answered the question last time.
And for the sake of clarity, in terms of how we answered it, it was to lead into the piece of research that has been commissioned. we don't know all of the reasons why, and we can't give you an empirical answer as to why that's gone up. Are we concerned about it? We've spoken a number of times, absolutely concerned about it, because if it was just 19% in the abstract, that's bad enough. But as we've talked about over the last 5 years, there has been a continuing increase in reporting of rape.
So what's the research that you've commissioned?
It's research that's being undertaken by MOPAC. We discussed it last time in February, in fact, and I'm expecting the result of it in the summer. What it's doing is getting beneath those, the presumptions. Is it about confidence in coming forward as reporting, or is it about an increase in actual incidents, or is it a combination of the two? Yeah. That's a piece of research that's been undertaken, and as I said, I'm expecting it to come to me by the end of August.
As I understood it, I think you said that it wasn't actually, this couldn't just be about reporting, increase in reporting. If you say something like there is something going on with sexual offending in London, that's horribly ominous and very vague. What are the terms of the research exactly? What actually are you looking at?
What we're looking at is trying to get underneath the increase in reports and to understand whether it is an increase in confidence, how much of it's historical or how much of it's relatively new, and whether it's about confidence or whether it's actually about an increase in incidents, or it's a combination of the two. That's what we're trying to get beneath, and that's what the research will get beneath. I'm expecting that report and the research to come to conclusion in the summer. And we're very happy to share it with you, and obviously
yes,
it'll be published anyway, so
yeah.
Like to write to us about, after this, about your terms of reference, some detail that you'd like.
I think this is the point, really. I mean, I'm just sort of surprised. I mean, just purely on terms of experience and, everyday experience, that you don't have any sort of idea as to why this might be happening. I mean, if it requires sort of a piece of research, it just seems a bit odd to me, really.
No, because this is an area, a bit like many other types of crime, where we already know there is massive underreporting. So I think I responded to the question. It would be wrong for us to say, oh, it's all right, this is all just an increase in reporting, people are more confident in us. We genuinely don't have the empirical evidence, and that's why it's right and proper this piece of research is done collectively. We have lots of ideas. My colleague who's sat in front of you before and talked about this, Martin Hewitt, leads nationally on some of these issues, and this is something that's happening across the country. What we don't have is, so it's important we do this piece of research to understand this. It would be awfully complacent of me to say, don't worry, this is all about a rise in confidence and move on. That's absolutely not what I was saying now, and it's not what I said then. So we know, so we can look at some quite easy parts of the data, how much of this rise is offences where the offence occurred sometime before it's reported, timelines, we can do that. But until we complete this research, we won't be able to say empirically, this is what we do, because that informs the policy response.
I think that's a fair response.
Okay, just to say that I mean, a little bit like with knife crime, I mean, you say there's great concern, but these figures, in any other context, if you like, in one where we didn't have something like knife crime going on, these would be headline figures. 20% rise in rape would be a headline figure. This is extraordinary that this is not more made.
We don't disagree with it. They are headline figures.
They may well now be headline figure, Peter, after this conversation.
They absolutely.
Peter, I completely agree with you. It is absolutely the amount of violence against women and girls in London is shocking.
Yeah.
MOPAC also, it's not just the actual reported incidents that are really, really concerning. We published a sexual violence needs assessment a year ago, which showed that in every one of the 32 London boroughs in London, every week a woman or girl is raped, and that is shocking, absolutely. And it's one of the, we've published the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. It's one of the priorities, and it is getting equal attention from us and from Metropolitan Police in terms of delivery. And this piece of research is an important piece of evidence. I'm really happy to, I'm sure, I'm really happy for whoever's conducting, for the Evidence and Insight team to come and talk to you about that piece of research, if that would be helpful.
That would be very
PCC.
Okay, I'm sure Peter will take that offer up. We will look forward to the conclusions over the summer. Unmesh.
Thank you, Chair. Deputy Mayor, if I can ask you a couple of questions, please. You chaired the Knife Crime Executive Board, which, as I understand things, is focused on short, sharp actions. Can you give us an example of such actions?
Yes, I am. I'm chairing a regular board which brings together the partners through the criminal justice system, as well as local authorities and health, to look at what short-term actions need to be taken in order to support the police in their enforcement actions and to make sure that the system is working properly. So what we are doing is the courts are around the table as well. We're looking to making sure that there is the capacity for the increased what we expect to be and is happening, increased arrests. I mean, for example, one of the things that we've done through that is look at the community engagement. A piece of work has been undertaken around community engagement from the Metropolitan Police with the local authorities. Really good piece of work, bringing together that community engagement, not just after critical incidents, but also, for example, when the Violent Crime Task Force goes in. The Met have a very good engagement processes around that, but it is how that's been worked through with stakeholders as well. That's a piece of work that has come forward. Health around the table, we're looking to see whether the liaison and diversion in custody can be prioritised around those hotspot areas. That's a piece of work that's been kicked off with the London NHS as well.
Last month, I think it was at the all-party parliamentary group on knife crime, in the meeting that a couple of us attended at the House of Commons. You talked about a serious violence strategy being developed. What can we expect to see from that, and when?
Obviously, we've got the knife crime strategy, which we published last June, which is very much focused on that element of violence. What we have been working on is looking at developing that into a longer-term strategy, and whether that needs to develop into a much more overarching serious violence strategy. That's a piece of work we're working on. The foundations and the bedrock of that are already in place in terms of enforcement and in terms of the prevention and early intervention that comes from the knife crime strategy. But that is a piece of work that we're working on. It's in train at the moment. I wouldn't like to put a figure, a date on that.
And finally, in terms of MOPAC, what actions are MOPAC taking to end this depressing cycle of violence that we are seeing?
Well,
apart from all the various initiatives that have been announced.
In terms of, one of the things that we are doing is obviously the partnership work, the executive board, the work through our governance structures in terms of the London Crime Reduction Board, which meets regularly under the chairmanship of the mayor, and that has always looked at knife crime in bringing the partners together. But the summit last week was an example of the role that I think MOPAC has done extremely well, which is to convene the leadership of London and to ensure that they are supported in the way that they're prioritising knife crime and violence. That is really, in practical terms, that meant analysing and assessing with the Metropolitan Police the action plans in every borough, and then looking to see what evidence there is of what works, and making sure and bringing forward a template for those action plans for every borough, so that there are consistent standards. And this isn't just MOPAC, this is working with London councils, and they have agreed, and that's what we've agreed to do, and that's going forward. I think that's a real step forward in terms of partnership work, convening of partners, and real practical steps coming out of it.
Thank you. Commissioner, if I can now ask you a couple of questions. So as we approach the height of summer, have you got any specific worries about the levels of violence starting to move in the wrong direction again?
Well, these crime types are subject to sort of seasonal trends, as you know. Longer days, hot weather, drink, that sort of thing on occasion can contribute. We have a comprehensive plan for the task force, and both on the overt uniform side and also the detectives, investigators and those working covertly, which takes us right through the summer, is planned in around the big events like the visits next week that we were talking about. As the Deputy Mayor has pointed out, is a twin-track approach in which we are looking to continuously learn, improve our tactics, make sure that we're identifying young people, safeguarding them, targeting the most dangerous, doing all the things we know work, and upping our presence and our enforcement activity at the same time as engaging, explaining, advocating, and being, having our dedicated ward officers, our schools officers, and at every meeting we can think of, telling people why we're here, what we're doing, what we're trying to do, and how they can help. And I have a lot of confidence that this operation has, operation's the wrong word, but this effort has borne fruit, and that we will continue to bear fruit through the summer. But this is a huge city, and things do happen sometimes. Things that we all would rather didn't happen have happened last year, and we need to be prepared for that. There could be, of course there could be, a ghastly homicide of a young person in difficult circumstances or whatever. And I've got no specific concerns, but I have a very good team, and I have a very, very experienced and capable senior team who will lead the Met and London through the summer.
I must say that, echoing what the Chair said earlier, that our visit to the Serious Violence Task Force, we found it, we were very impressed. I think I speak on behalf of the whole committee. And this was we went out with them on patrol, and the way that they worked at all that, so I must commend you for that. But I'm going to put this to you. There's a view which I don't share, which was expressed at this committee meeting last month, that the reason that there's an increase in violent crime is a belief that people who are committing this violent crime think that they're going to get away with it. Now, I don't share that view, but I would ask you that last week, at the last week's State of London debate, and I know that you can't comment on specifics of a case, but a member of the audience did give an example of how a 14-year-old brother was chased by a group of people with knives, saved by passerby, and Deputy Mayor was there, I think, as well at the meeting. The police attended, the suspects were identified to the police. They were shown the house party with the young men carrying the knives were attending. Despite all this, we hear that the police did not attend the party despite it taking place only 15 doors down the road. 5 days later, so we are told, the women have still not received a CAD number. Is this an example of people getting away, thinking that they can get away with such crime, such actions?
You're right to say I won't comment on individual cases. Suffice to say that I know that the matter that was referred through the Mayor's office to my office, there has now been further follow-up. But it is also true, I think, that all the research would show that one aspect of deterrence is people's feeling of the likelihood of them being caught. So severity of punishment is important, but also likelihood of being caught is important in stopping people thinking they might do something that is criminal. There are whole loads of other things as well, which are probably even more important, like social norms and, what mum has said and all that kind of stuff. But actually, the notion that you are likely to get caught is an important deterrent factor, and is important to me as a police leader that people know that the Met does see itself absolutely in the business of being out there and arresting people and bringing them to justice and investigating crimes if they do happen, serious crimes like this, to a high standard. I want serious offenders locked up, and I want them locked up quickly. And I know we can get even better at this, and I'm not going to comment on the specifics of that. We don't always get it right for a variety of different reasons, but this is something we are absolutely determined to continue to improve and improve and improve.
For that message.
Well, I've got a couple more questions. We are entering into the third hour. We've got 2 more areas to cover, so if we could pick up pace a bit. So first of all, Caroline, I think, and then Sean.
Yes, I have, since I was even on the police authority, been stressing the importance of the Cardiff model, where hospitals share anonymised data in accidents and emergencies with the police, so you're able to shape your resourcing. And you've seen last week the architect of the model, Surgeon Jonathan Shepherd, told the Standard that London needs a violence prevention board to properly analyse the data, rather than at the moment you look at it and you send it out to the local partnerships and it isn't properly being sort of strategically dealt with. So I'm wondering, what is the point of collecting this data if you're not actively using it? This is a tool that's shown to work. So what is the Met doing around that to properly use that data linked to MOPAC. And furthermore, you know, we've gradually got all the A&Es doing this, but Chelsea and Westminster, in a recent mayor's question, collect the data, but they don't share it yet. I mean, what are you doing to make sure, that was a recent answer I've had from the mayor, what are you doing to make sure that they share the data? It seems basic, it's a tool that works.
It is a tool that works, and Cardiff's done, I mean, everyone knows the fantastic work that Cardiff's done. I'm not sure that he was fully aware of the governance structures that we have within City Hall, and how that we do have a London Crime Reduction Board chaired by the Mayor, which absolutely is that type of, you know, is what he was calling for.
Does that board analyse this data every time
Well,
it meets?
Not the board doesn't analyse that data. We have people analysing that data, and it is shared. I will pick up the Chelsea and Westminster point, because I must admit I wasn't aware
Last
of that.
month, that's a question.
Yeah,
and
I'll
answer
pick
in the
that
last
up.
month.
But we have, for example, I spoke at a conference of all the trauma unit, well, not just trauma, accident, emergency, and local authorities and police a couple of months ago, which was absolutely about ensuring that that information sharing to tackle violence was embedded, that the analysis was shared. So I'm not entirely convinced he knew all the ways in which it is being shared, and all the ways in which that governance structure around violence reduction is working with, not just from City Hall, but with the Metropolitan Police as well. If there are incidences like Chelsea and Westminster, I will take that up, and I will look into why, if it is the case that that isn't being shared. But I think we now have 28 of the 29 A&E departments sharing that information.
That's the one that's not.
The 29th, I'm not sure. The 29th, I was told, was not fully signed up because their IT systems were not enabled, and it was it wasn't an issue of lack of will. It was a lack of technological capability to do that, and that is being sorted.
Well, your latest mayoral answer sounds different to the information you've got there.
I'll double
Could I
check
also
that.
just pick up another issue, maybe for the Commissioner? At the weekend, I think it was 4 people were stabbed at a festival, Garage Nation, not one I'm particularly familiar with complaints from festival goers that security was not rigorous enough at that event. Given these type of festivals over the summer are licensed by authorities, what are you doing to work with the licensing authorities, but also the security firms, to make sure that these places are safe when people want to go out and enjoy themselves?
So we do work very closely with licensing authorities, and of course with big events of any sort. The responsibilities for who does what is very clear, but we have a role to support people who are organising events in their understanding of what their responsibilities are and how they should be doing that. In relation to the Hainault event, horrible stabbings, huge concern. It's not a new, as you know, it's not a new festival, it's one that's been running for a number of years. There is a very significant debrief going on, I know, by the organisers and their security firm, and indeed the local officers and the local authority will be taking a huge interest in that, I am sure. My sort of sketchy initial understanding is that they had measures in place which they felt were very sufficient. However, there came a moment when the sheer volume of people meant arriving and wanting to get in meant that they reduced some of their standards, and that is their explanation for how the weapons were available in there. Now, nobody should sort of underestimate the lengths to which some people, and I can't say about this case, but some people will go to conceal weapons or drugs or other illicit goods to get them into an environment if they want to do something. We're all very familiar with that. But it is vital, as you say, we go forward in the next, through the summer with these big events, that organisers and security firms understand their responsibilities, the risks there may be, the likely, the information and intelligence there is around about what could happen, and that we work really closely with them on the day if we have any concerns or any information. And we discussed this on Monday morning. Absolutely, my officers will be doing this over the summer in the way that you would expect, I think, Caroline.
Thank you very much.
I think, and I've seen you, Sean, but Keith, you want to come in on this incident?
Yes, please, yeah. Do you think it's right, Cressida, that as the Assembly member, the first I get to hear about this is on the news?
I think it is not, in the modern age, unlikely, I'm afraid. I think it is, I can't speak of exactly what happened there. I don't know when you were watching the news and how long later, but I'm afraid, on the one hand, it is perfectly plausible that any of us in the room could hear about a stabbing or even a homicide from the news before we hear it through other channels. That's the nature of the modern world. That said, I am concerned that we do ensure that in our current and future structures we have effective ways of keeping all our partners at senior levels and political leaders of various different sorts informed of the things that they should be informed of. You will understand, as Craig has said, that on occasion we have people who say, I'm not suggesting this about you talking, but I didn't know anything about that, and then we discover 4 messages were left and they didn't contact, or their office didn't contact them. It is a complicated set of people, all with slightly different thresholds, different understandings, different interests, that we are trying to keep informed. But I've been talking to Mark Simmons, who you'll be seeing soon, about the need, particularly in the new structures, that we ensure that Assembly members and others are informed of critical incidents appropriately.
You see, Cressida, my worry is that with the advent of the area book queues, the tri-borough arrangement that we have, myself and Umesh Desai, we met with someone at the book queue a few weeks ago, and we were promised that we would be kept informed of these sort of things, but it hasn't happened. We haven't even been told about the redactions that are going to be taking place in relation to Donald Trump, whereas other Assembly members have all been told. So can you ensure, please, that something's put in place?
I'll take your comments back, of course I will. I think if you put yourselves in the shoes of my people, who do have an enormous amount to think about, we of course want consistency. I'm afraid our stakeholders don't all have the same thresholds or the same interests. Some people couldn't give a hoot about DWOs and whether they're on Trump or not. They would see it as quite a small tactical issue. Why on earth are you bothering me? And other people would see it as very important, and why does he know and I don't?
First of all, a couple of things there. And I do appreciate that the police probably have got better things to do than tell us what they're doing. But, in relation to the DWOs, that's breaking the mayoral promise of 2 DWOs per ward, and his promise to not have them redacted. Having said that, absolutely understand there are exceptions to that. But
we always said there would be.
That's why that is important that we know about that. And I'm not criticising that move, because I've always said that borough commanders should have more flexibility around DWOs anyway. So that's that point. But the point I'm making is that other boroughs have a list of people who are informed of incidents. So, for instance, on that list you may have the chair of the local SMB, you may have the local member of parliament, and usually you have the local ward councillor. Well, all I'm asking is to be put on that list, and that's all that I believe Assembly Member Desai is always asking. And yes, I understand that being a tri-borough is different, but there must be like a primary list for notifying members of parliament. We just need to be on that list.
That seems entirely reasonable, of course. If there is a list, then Assembly members should be on the list, and we should have a reasonable level of expectation that is consistent across London about who might be informed in what circumstances about what. And that is exactly what I'm talking to Mark about. I don't think we will keep everybody happy all of the time, even then. And I do think there will be occasions on which people will hear things from the news, not from the police.
I get that. Just to sort of make the point, though, I can understand it might take a bit of time to find out who the particular ward councillor is in a particular incident, but I cover 2/3 of that new book queue. So it's pretty much easy. It's really easy. And I don't mind if I get information about B&D, and I don't mind if my colleague Umesh gets information about Havering and Redbridge. Just let us know what's happening in that whole book queue, so we're just on the list. We don't have to worry about it.
Yeah. I think it's an opportunity with the new Bokus to refresh the arrangements. And it's an opportunity, isn't it, really?
It is, absolutely, and that's what I've been talking to Mark about.
Okay, now, Len, is this on the Hainault? I know I've seen you, Sean, but is this on this specific piece?
No, this is on Violent Task Force.
In which case I saw Sean first then.
I have a very quick question about the summer. what are you tasking the Safer Schools officers with doing during the school holidays, and how many of them do you have at the moment?
Goodness. I don't... sorry?
319.
319, am I right?
Yeah.
We thought about 300.
I thought 300, but 319.
319. I can't give you the specific taskings, of course, but we have a whole series of different summer holiday activities going on in local areas, many of which we have upped because of the violent crime background, which we are engaging the schools officers in. Some of them will use some of that time for leave, and some of them will use some of that time also for training and development of one sort or another. But we try always to keep them, if they're not developing themselves in some particular way, then we try to keep them in their kind of core activity, working with young people in the various different events, some organised by the Met, some by other people, that are going on in local areas across the summer period.
Are there any details you can give us of that, or do you have a summary?
I probably don't have a summary without going out and seeking it, because it will vary. Obviously, the schools, it will vary very much depending on the schools. If there's something to hand, I'll share it.
Okay, I'm also asking councils the same question.
No.
So,
Okay, sorry, Len.
My question, we were fortunate to have Ellen Ball in front of us talking about the violent task force, but it became apparent during the meeting, and I just want to match up between what you said as the deterrent, because I'm on with you on that, about what you know, it's one aspect of it. One issue that I think, Martin, you had mentioned last week at the Knife Crime Summit is the problem of the wall of silence that's met within the community, and I thought that was a bit taken. So my line of questioning to Ellen Ball was that when the Violent Task Force goes into an area, there was a good opportunity for a wider engagement of doing the right thing, coming forward with information that you may not either come forward to the police on concerning criminal activities in the area, or you might go to Crime Stoppers. Yeah. And I just thought we were missing the point. Now, I know it's early days and the Violent Task Force is working there. Do you not think we need to refresh and revive these pathways of where people can give us information that could be important to all sorts of investigations, but particularly about violence and their worries and concerns? What worries me, have we got the capacity to deal with it? And of course, some of it might not be as important as the person thinks, but they think they're doing the right thing and want the police to bring it to their attention. So where are we on that, and what do we, in terms of, it just seems a no-brainer, fewer resources, wanting people to engage, and it's not just the police that need to be engaged on it, the wider community does.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sure there's further to go. I would acknowledge that, Len, as we go forward. But I do think we are doing a great deal of that. I really do. We do face this challenge, particularly after some of the most serious crimes, that all people present and their families, for whatever reason, are not prepared to give us information which is evidential. Many people will give us information for intelligence, but they're not prepared to make a statement, and they're concerned about that. And sometimes it's a struggle even to get the information and the intelligence. This is obviously part of a whole, we've started the questioning with confidence, and people's confidence in the criminal justice system and their police service to be able to investigate effectively, to bring people to justice and keep them safe is absolutely fundamental to this. It is a massive challenge at the moment in certain areas, in certain sort of parts of some of our communities. We are, as I said, I've appointed Helen within her professionalism role to lead on inclusion, diversity, engagement. She has a commander, Mark McEwen, who some of you will have met, who is absolutely at the forefront of our enforcement operations in terms of dealing with how we explain ourselves, how we engage, how we encourage, and how we get more information in from the public before and about and after offences. We are seeing a lot of public involvement, which is great. We are getting lots of information about where weapons are stashed, about who may have done what, every day we get lots, and we are able to action that and action that and action a lot. And a lot of the results that you see come from the public saying to us, I don't want to be on your weapon sweep, but I can tell you if you just look there, or whatever. So I think we need to have a massive kind of across the parties kind of campaign about this. I agree, and really publicise the fact that you know we are interested, we will respond. We can't always tell you the immediate answer, but everything you want to tell us may well be helpful, and we will do our absolute best to protect people who do come forward. And we do need to do that through, for example, the borough plans that Sophie was talking about before. The partners have a massive part to play in encouraging Crime Stoppers or you know, other hotlines, or indeed talking direct to your schools officer, your DWO.
Okay, thank you. Right, moving on to the next set of questions. Now, we've talked at length, quite rightly, about serious violence, knife violence, terrorism, etc. However, I'd like to turn to two headings that are connected, which is the borough priorities that were set within the borough plans, and also what is often called low-level, high-volume crime, which particularly affects neighbourhoods, what I would call neighbourhood crimes. They may be the same, i.e. borough priorities, or they may not be. And I want to talk about those for a while and ask some questions around that. So my first observation, talking about those crimes, for example, burglary, robbery, motor vehicle crime, has risen. Those figures have risen considerably. I've got them in the latest MOPAC report, Craig. And this is of concern. Now, you'll know that these kind of crimes were in the lamented or not lamented MOPAC 7, and they were reduced then. And these are crimes that actually disproportionately do affect neighbourhoods. So a burglary in a street will affect the confidence and the fears of that street. And from the figures that we've got, we have seen those crimes rising considerably, Craig. So would you like to comment on that?
By all means. Thank you, Chair. So I think, so if you look at the local priorities overall, of which some of you mentioned are
not,
local
yes.
priorities, I mean, actually against local priorities at the moment, 38 priorities are showing reductions, 29 are showing increases. So we're slightly, we're ahead of the curve in terms of the reductions and local priorities. And I know you're short of time. There is a long list of them. And if members haven't seen them...
To be helpful, we've got them here, Craig. What I don't want to do is conflate the neighbourhood crimes completely with local priorities. As you say, within the local priorities, most boroughs have chosen burglary. And burglary is tending to go in the wrong direction, whereas violence with injury, again a local priority, is tending, pleasingly, to go in the right direction.
Yeah.
But it's more the neighbourhood crimes I want you to comment on.
No. So there are a number of national trends, particularly around property crimes, that I think are worth doing.
Yeah.
We've spoken here before about when the uptick happened around things like burglary, which we did see an uptick both in London and across the country. And you also mentioned vehicle crime, and I think it's important and we've spoken about this a number of times before, to disaggregate vehicle crime. So some of the vehicle crime you're seeing is the theft of powered two-wheel motorcycles, which we spoke about early last year, a number of us. That has shown substantial falls. We've spoken a lot publicly about the new area of vehicle crime that worries us, are keyless car thefts and keyless van thefts as well. So we know that the focus on vehicle crime has moved quite a lot in terms of that, and that's where the activity and focus is in terms of doing that.
You say focus, I'll cut across you. When you say focus, clearly we talked about, yes, limited resources. Yeah. They are being moved towards certain areas that are absolutely key priorities. Are you sensing that with that shift, the eye is being taken off the ball on these neighbourhood crimes?
Oh, so if you take, and I've got a number of examples we could go through of operations across the Met, particularly around burglary, where there are real work going on, real arrests being made. So you look at things like some of the work in the East Area BCU around burglary. There's been some real progress and some real success in terms of that. The reality is, as always, you know, if you have a priority, you're going to focus on a priority. That's the purpose of setting priorities. And I think the other bit very much around these local crimes and impact and local priorities, as we look to refresh them, you know, at the moment the work's ongoing in terms of refreshing very much those local priorities for the next operational year. It's really important that the work's going on is properly informed to understand what the current threat and picture is going forward. So one of the ones we haven't talked about there, but one of the ones that I'm focusing and pushing around, as in the Met is focusing and pushing around, is the robbery issues. So I want to see robbery starting to come down as part of the work we're doing in relation to that. But absolutely, that burglary work is going on across the Met, and there are some real examples of where it's coming down across those boroughs.
I mean, indeed, the robbery figures are very, very high.
Yeah.
For year on year, around the 25%
yeah.
figures, which is unacceptable. And as a comment, it is a great shame about burglary, because we've been talking about this for a long time, to the degree that burglary, there was a dramatic decrease in burglary a couple of years or so ago. And it's a shame to see it going back in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and that's why we're talking about the work we're doing around it. I mean, burglary, as you know, and we discussed probably 2 years ago, we hit historic lows, particularly in London for burglary, but in this country for burglary. So we've spoken about things like the Met Trace, the industrialisation of those burglary processes. That's a lot of the work that's going on. But, you know, the other thing that's going on here is good old-fashioned detective work. You know, there are people being arrested and locked up for burglaries as we speak. That's what's driving some of these reductions in some of the key areas. What we've got to do on the burglary one, and there is some sign of the trend plateauing around burglary, is keep that momentum going. Around vehicle crime, as we discussed earlier on, it is really being about fleet of foot. That is changing quite a lot. I am sure as we work with the industry and suppliers, some of these new opportunities around vehicle crime we'll be able to reduce collectively.
Okay. And obviously a comment again is that this is why the importance of the local teams.
Yeah, absolutely.
And importance that they do their prevention work around there. Question I really got for the Deputy Mayor, if I may, is moving directly on to the borough priorities that you spent some time, 18 months or so, visiting boroughs to varying degrees. And thank you for that. I joined you at in Croydon, of course. And I hear that you're in the process of refreshing those priorities. Do you want to just talk briefly about that refresh?
Yeah, we have refreshed those priorities. We went through an exercise of that earlier in the year. As before, it's very much data-driven, looking at what's happening in the boroughs, but actually having those discussions with the Chief Executive, the leader and the borough commander as to, does this data bear out your understanding and your priorities in the area. And those priorities are obviously influenced by the Community Safety Partnership, the ward panels and the community. So we have done that exercise and they have all been refreshed and agreed, and you should be able to find them on the MOPAT website. So we have done that, and obviously I continue to visit boroughs, and as part of that exercise I did have those conversations, not with all boroughs but with some boroughs around those priorities. Can I just pick up on this issue, you know what I'm going to say, about the MOPAC 7 and crime falling, and now we no longer have the MOPAC 7 crime going up. Crime is going up throughout the country.
Words out of my mouth, Deputy Mayor.
This is what your supposition was. Crime is, and Craig did touch on this, but I think it is really important to really highlight this. Crime is going up in England and Wales faster than it is going up within London. Overall, it's increased by 15.3% across England and Wales and 7.1% in London. It doesn't mean it's not concerning and it's not an issue and it's not something that absolutely has to be tackled. But we've got to really place it in that national context. This isn't about the MOPAC 7 or not the MOPAC 7. This is about trends and crime rising, and we can go back to why those are the drivers of that and the causes of that.
I think you have been unusually sensitive and putting words in my mouth. The fact was, I was referring to the fact that burglary figures are going in the wrong direction. I commented they did exist under MOPAC 7, that's in the past. We need to think about the present, of course.
And just to reassure you, and one of the things, so in looking at longer trends, and I'm not one to sort of say one swallow makes a summer, far from, but if you look at total notifiable offences, I've been watching those, you know, over 3 years. End of February, they've started to level off this year. So those rises in crime that we saw across that whole bucket of total notifiable offences have started to level off across London. So it's going to be interesting to watch what lies in the detail in the buckets below that.
Yeah. Before we move on to the last set of questions, which is flow, the resetting of the priorities will inform the bidding for the 2-year financial settlements with boroughs. Are you getting to that stage where the borough deals are 2 years, aren't they, the funding? we're getting into that next stage of the next 2 years, are we not? Or am I getting that wrong?
Yes, I mean, you're talking about the London Crime Prevention
Indeed,
Fund.
yes.
Yes, we are in discussions with local London councils about that at the moment. Yeah. It doesn't affect the what the borough... It's up to the boroughs. They get... Sorry, start again. They have an allocation from the London Crime Prevention Fund. Those boroughs can decide what they wish to spend that on. It's across through, as long as it's priorities within the police and crime plan. It may well be one of their local priorities. It may be one of the London-wide priorities around violence or domestic abuse or sexual violence. It is for them to decide that. They aren't inextricably linked in terms of funding following the priorities.
I understand the suite of priorities do include overarching pan-London priorities, but all those, I fondly call them the MOPAC 6 now, which is the cross-London plus the local priorities. The funding will be driven by those borough priorities in the whole, won't they? Generally.
I would expect local authorities to pick what they want to spend their money on, depending on what their priorities are. Absolutely.
Makes sense, doesn't it?
But it is for them to decide that and put that to MOPAC rather than us to tell them what they should be spending that money on.
Thank you very much. Flo, do you want to take the last section?
Thank you. Good afternoon to you all. I think one of the things that we've been looking at is around inclusion and diversity, which I know is a big priority for you, Commissioner. And you stated that by 2020, essentially you wanted the Met to be a very ambitious target of 40% of recruits intake to be from the BME community and for 50% to be women by 2020. If we look at the figures from April 2018, the snapshot is not quite positive. So only 14% of the Met officers are from the BME background, and you look at in comparison to London's population, which is hovering around 43-44%. And I think we have seen some really good initiatives coming forward from the Met, so I very much welcome the new proposal on positive discrimination, where you're saying that training costs for new recruits and women will be paid for. That's really great. But the reality is that if we look through the ranks of the police, the higher up you go in rank, the lower the diversity is. So I just wanted to get a sense of what more do you think that the Met can do, looking at some of the improvements you made over the last year to actually address this important issue.
Perhaps I can start by saying, forgive me, I don't actually remember the 40%, 50% figure, so I need to double check that. Yeah. I don't remember saying that, but I am ambitious for the Met, obviously, in this sphere, and as I've mentioned, that's why, amongst other things, I've appointed Helen to oversee and Mark McEwen to lead on inclusion, diversity and community engagement, and I myself chair our board and am pushing very hard on this issue. We, I think, can be proud of the, nothing to do with me, but the improvements that have been made over the last few years in terms of the proportion of black and minority ethnic recruits coming in. That has been a very dramatic increase, but against a very large organisation. And as you say, we are a long way off from reflecting London's communities. We have the opportunity at the moment to recruit at reasonably high levels. I want to get a message out everywhere to say we are recruiting. I think often the rhetoric of the public service cuts and all that kind of thing, and policing cuts, has meant people don't realise that we are open for business, but we absolutely are in the recruiting business. And we've got a good campaign running right now with lots of interest being shown, particularly from people in our black minority ethnic communities. And we will have further campaigns in the autumn. We're about to start celebrating 100 years of women in the Met, and we have a big push on bringing more women in, and we've got a series of campaigns around recruitment. You make the point about retention, we make the point about progression, and you are absolutely right, particularly, again, in relation to black minority ethnic representation. It is not, the constable rank is very different from the superintendent rank, let's say. And we have a whole series of different things going on there to identify talent, to take positive action, I think, as opposed to discrimination from before the point of entry, as you have described, and right through to try to ensure that we get the best of our people and that all of them are able to, feel that they can be themselves and thrive and progress in whatever way they want to. That might be vertical progression, it might be specialisation. There's a whole series of activities going on at the moment. There's a lot of buzz about it. If you were to speak to our staff associations, I think they're quite excited about what we're doing. This linking of the external with the internal in a very sort of clear way all the time, I think is very important, because this is actually all about policing, providing the best possible policing service to our public, and we can't detach the inside from the outside. I know that we're not going to be able to wave a magic wand. We have a very low churn rate of officers. We still have a very low churn rate of officers, whatever you might read elsewhere. And although we're using all sorts of imaginative techniques to bring people in different ways, at different levels, as police officers and staff, this is not going to change the face of the Met overnight.
So, I won't mention any names, but again, there have been examples, some very high profile, of senior BME officers and some of the issues they faced with the Met, and that being exposed and them coming out to speak about it once they're close to retirement or once they've left. So do you think there is still a problem with, in inverted commas, institutional racism and the way BME officers are treated? And do you think that the Met has a problem in terms of retaining those officers?
We are not seeing a problem with retention at the moment. I take every one of those comments seriously. Of course I do. Often they reflect somebody's experience over a 30-year lifetime with the organisation. We have taken very, very seriously our latest staff survey and drilled right down into any disparities there may be about how different people are feeling within the organisation, about the way they are treated. We have identified, and I've been talking with our Black Police Association and others, there seems to be still, we're not the only organisation that has this, but there seems to be still a difference in the way black women feel about being in the Met. Overall, a small proportion who are feeling less confident and comfortable than black men or other colleagues. So that's an issue we're drilling right down in at the moment, and I'm having lots of kind of focus groups and a real desire to make sure that if there is any lingering unfairness or clumsiness or inappropriate conduct or lack of support for somebody who feels different, that we actually deal with that. But it's for others to judge, I think, your question about institutional racism. But I have set out for, the Met to be the most trusted police service in the world, and I want our staff to feel absolutely at ease, whoever they are.
And something that's linked to diversity and inclusion and diversity is around, obviously, interaction of police officers with different specific communities across London, so London being very diverse and culturally mixed, and especially in the run-up to the summer, where we will see more officers out on the street, rightly so, as the schools break up. I just wanted to draw your attention to an incident which was widely reported on social media last week, which I'm sure you've probably watched as well, and I appreciate you may not be able to comment because you weren't there. Maybe your senior officers weren't there. I wasn't there either, and we are going by what we see. But do you think that a lot more needs to be done in terms of the training and that deep working with different communities? So it doesn't necessarily just mean we need more BME officers, which can help in addressing some of these situations, but actually some of that training that maybe white and other officers need to get. So I'm referring to the issue with George Mpenga, who was arrested, famous guy, poet, really bright background, but it went from a stop around vehicle insurance to a strip search and quickly escalated within minutes. But again, that sense of certain communities feeling that they can't trust the police because the police don't know how to interact with them.
So I talked earlier, and indeed when I first became Commissioner, I talked about this kind of confidence gap, this trust gap that we are aware of. I hope this doesn't sound grandiose, but I suspect one of the reasons I might have been appointed as Commissioner is because I have worked in the city for a very long time, and I have worked on sort of diversity and inclusion issues for much of that time. And I fully understand that we have further to go in some parts of London, in some parts of some of our communities, for people to feel that this is their service which can be trusted to act fairly in every way. And I believe it can be trusted and should be trusted to act fairly, but that doesn't count. It is a trustworthy police service that does act fairly. I'm completely convinced of that. But that doesn't count if you're the young person on the street in you know, wherever, Stockwell or Hackney. And so, of course, we've got more to do to ensure. I believe my officers, in relation to Stop Search, are very highly trained, they are very professional, they're supported now by their body-worn video, and they are very thoughtful about the work they are doing. So as we've been going into places like, for example, Haringey, with the Violent Crime Task Force, officers who don't necessarily always work there, we've ensured that the borough commander or her deputy has been briefing them personally. We've ensured that they have local officers with them and community members while they go out doing their patrols. We've ensured that they fully understand that this is an area which they need to you know, kind of think about perhaps slightly differently from the one that they normally work in terms of how they interact with people. So we're working really hard at this. In relation to the specific incident that you mentioned, as you say, none of us were there. What I can say is that there was a considerable amount of body-worn video in relation to that. I can say that my senior officers have reviewed what has gone on. I can say that in that review it is clear that the gentleman was not subject to a strip search, and it is also clear, however, that he is was not happy with how it all went. We have reached out to contact him. Adi Adelakan, who some of you know, will be meeting with him soon. I am quite content that from the information that has been written down by the body-worn video, the officers acted professionally and courteously. If there is lessons to be learned, or indeed, if Mr. Morango wants to make a complaint, of course, then we will first of all learn lessons, and secondly, if he wishes to make a complaint, that will be investigated. My sense is that when he views the body-worn video and we have that conversation with him, that there may be a different feeling all around. And that is the strength of body-worn video.
I think it's something that we've definitely pushed for in this committee, and I've been pushing for before I became an Assembly member. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for clarity around that incident as much as you can. Well, guests, thank you very much for attending today.
Yeah, can I just go back to one issue, to clarify an answer for you? Because I'm very conscious, Assemblyman Dismore, when we were talking about DWO abstractions for next week's visit, we talked around 12-hour shifts. The core Met is not going on 12-hour shifts. And the DWO abstractions, which I've just got through, literally, it's 265 for each of those 2 days.
So apologies for texting. Yeah. I heard the exchange. I thought, actually, I don't think we've been entirely accurate there.
Can you just amplify that 265 for 2 days? What do you mean?
265 on one day and 265 on the next day.
Right, that would be the requirement.
That's the DW. You asked me specifically about the DWO abstraction.
Yeah, the DWO abstraction requirement.
Yeah. The more substantive point is the Met is not on 12-hour shifts.
All right, we've got that.
Some officers will work extended shifts, as they do very frequently on public order operations.
Is that the BCU officers who are left behind?
Yes, so normal in CN, they're not going on 12-hour shifts.
Okay, got that. We'll just take that as a given and then pursue at another time. Right, thank you for that. Can I ask, and again, thank you again. That's twice I thanked you. Perhaps even 3 times. Right, can I ask the committee to note the monthly report from MOPAC? Thank you. Can you also note the report and answers given by the Deputy Mayor and the Metropolitan Police today? And also there'll be letters following exchanging of information. Item 8, can I ask the committee to note the work programme agreed to our 18th of July slot, as I discussed in the pre-meet, agree in relation to urgent matters of general delegation authority to myself in consultation with Group Leader Caroline Pidgeon, which may or may not involve a letter regarding Trump funding, and I'll come back to you around that. The date of the next public meeting is the 5th of September, though of course we have an internalised meeting on the 18th of July.
Great,
I have
thank
no
you
other
very
business. Thank you very much, members.
Thank you, Chair.